Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 9, Storm Part 1. There are only two mistakes one can make along the road to truth: not going all the way, and not starting. Buddha. So how do you feel? Narrowed violet eyes looked across the clearing at pupilless teal ones for a secant. Gaara looked down for a moment, staring at his hand as he turned it back and forth before looking back up at the blonde across from him. It is hard to explain. Is the world always so quiet for you? Naruto just gave a small smile before wincing, clutching his stomach in pain. I'm sure it only seems that way now. Don't worry, I'm sure you'll get used to it. He chuckled as the redhead suddenly yawned, stretching his arms up above his head. I feel as though for the first time in my life I can finally rest. Naruto stood up with a pained wince, slightly hunched over as he clutched his stomach. He walked over to his new friend as fast as he could, which was fairly slow, and patted him gently on the shoulder. You've earned it. However, Gaara wasn't looking at him. He instead looked on as the sand armor that had parted at Naruto's touch reformed almost as soon as the blonde moved away. He blinked as a frown settled on his features. Quickly he raised an arm, palm outstretched in front of him. As if in response, the ground quivered, sand rising from the floor in a loose pillar that swayed uncertainly. He allowed it to drop, instead creating a kunai before quickly thrusting it towards his arm. Naruto watched on in interest as sand immediately sprung up around the redhead, blocking the kunai before it could come close to his skin. Gaara allowed the kunai to fall away into dust, just staring at his hands in shock and confusion. Naruto used the opportunity to walk over, setting himself down next to the former Tsunagenin. I do not understand. With the Aikibi removed, should I have not lost my abilities over the sands? Naruto raised an eyebrow before giving the boy a reassuring pat on the back. I thought they were your own abilities. You agreed to this, knowing you might lose your powers. Gaara just nodded, still staring at his hands incredulously. Suddenly he looked up, his eyes slightly desperate. Attack me. Naruto just tilted his head before standing up and reaching for where his shakuju rested against a nearby tree. With one solid swing he spun the wooden staff once before attempting to crack it against the boy's arm. Surprisingly, sand once again sprung up, blocking the thrust like a steel wall before it could impact. I do not understand at all. What is still protecting me? By what will does the sand move? Naruto gave a small unhelpful shrug as he sat back down, resting his staff against his shoulder so he could once again place his hand on his stomach. I guess that is something you will have to find out for yourself. Again Gaara nodded rather absently, continuing to test his obviously retained powers with various weapons made of sand. It had taken nearly all night to extract Gaara's Biju safely. Naruto had assumed it would be similar to Sora's procedure, but he had failed to take into account the consciousness of Shukaku. It seemed the great Tanuki didn't much appreciate being ripped from its host, so it fought back. Plus, because it was a complete Biju, it took much longer than just sealing a bit of the Kyuubi's leftover chakra. Naruto was feeling the aftereffects though. An intense pain was circulating his body like somebody had replaced his blood with acid. It was centered on his stomach, so he could only assume it was all the excess chakra he had absorbed. While his body had become accustomed to the Biju chakra thanks to the slow leakage from the Kyuubi's seal, it was still an entire Biju's worth, which was no small amount. Right now Naruto was putting on a bit of a brave face for Gaara, but inside his Preta path was working overtime in either integrating the new foreign chakra or trying to push it into the seal. We need to check if there is any lingering chakra in your system. Once again he merely received an absent nod as if Gaara's neck was only working on autopilot. Shrugging, Naruto placed his hand on Gaara's chest, closing his eyes as he felt out the former Jinchuriki's chakra. He frowned as he felt something there. It wasn't a remnant of Shukaku, he was certain of that. It was like somebody had almost laced Gaara's chakra with their own. He could feel it acting independently of his usual chakra system, yet at the same time moving in perfect sync with his body. It must have taken place at an extremely young age for the two to be so well integrated, and it must have been from somebody with very similar chakra, like a family member. Which gave Naruto an idea. "Gaara, did you know your mother?" The redhead finally looked up, jerked out of his trance-like state, and only just then realizing Naruto had his hand against his skin. "I was told she died the day I was born, complications due to the Aikibi being sealed within me." Naruto gave him a very warm smile which confused the poor redhead. "So she gave her life in order to give you yours. I cannot think of a truer expression of love." Gaara's face soured at that, his hair shadowing his eyes momentarily. "My uncle told me that my mother despised me from the moment she saw me, calling me a weak and feeble child. That was just before he tried to murder me under my father's orders." Naruto descended to a crouch next to the former vessel, a warm hand on his shoulder and a warmer smile across his features. "Maybe you should choose not to believe them. I believe your mother's will lives on in that sand, protecting you." Gaara looked up, confusion evident in his eyes. However, one look at the kindly and confident gleam in Naruto's eyes and his own meek smile began to spread across his features. "You have done so much for me, Naruto, and I still do not fully understand why." He looked away, staring into the forest that surrounded the duo with a new feeling welling up in his chest: hope. "However, I do know now that I want to understand." He turned back around, the small developing smile still present across his lips. "Thank you for everything." Naruto returned it gladly before wincing slightly and letting out a slightly strained chuckle. "What will you do now?" "I could always use a friend on my travels. I can't promise comfort or security, but I can offer companionship at least." His response was the redhead's smile growing slightly. "I think I would like that, but I will have to decline." Naruto just nodded understandingly. He shifted his staff to his other hand before extending the appendage towards the ex-Jinchuriki. "Then I wish you luck as you find your own path in the world, Gaara no Sabaku." Gaara looked down at the extended hand for only a fraction of a second before grasping it strongly in his own, the sand from the contact falling to the ground at their feet. "The same for you, Naruto Uzumaki." Compared with the blistering heat of the desert, a warm sunny day in Kawa-no-Kuni was incredibly relaxing for the walking monk. The trees around him reminded him of his home at the temple, so there was a genuinely content smile on his face as he traveled down a long, stretching road. The sky was blue above him without a single cloud in sight. On days like this all the monks would be outside, either meditating or enjoying the day with friends. So he was confused then when out of the blue the skies opened and a deluge of water began to fall from the sky. He looked up, blinking away the droplets of water that tried to reach his eyes, and sure enough the sky was completely overcast by clouds. Shrugging it off as one of those strange occurrences, the blonde just moved on, pulling the hood of his robes up to fend off the worst of it. However, what he really couldn't ignore was when it suddenly stopped, not lighten or ease up, just stop. Looking up again he saw nothing but clear blue sky and the occasional lazy white cloud, none of which looked heavy enough to rain. The whole event took about 5 minutes in total, and it had the poor blonde thrown for a loop. He had never seen such crazy weather. Again he just about managed to pass it off as the local climate, however he still had a nagging feeling something was wrong. He had passed through river country on the way to Suna, and that definitely had not happened before. He stopped off in a clearing not too far from the side of the road, quickly setting up a fire so he could dry off his clothes. As he waited he adopted his traditional sitting pose before allowing his mind to fall away deep into his own consciousness. Well, that doesn't seem good. For once when Naruto entered the seal he was not in the Kyuubi's cell room, he was back in the corridors. However, he immediately noticed the difference. A new pipe adorned the roof, larger than the pipes he assumed represented his own chakra but smaller than the pipe reserved for the Kyuubis. The ground at his feet was wet, most likely due to the terrible state of the new pipe. It was cracked and leaking. Like the Kyuubi's chakra, Naruto could see the Aikibi's chakra eat away at the floor of the corridor. It was at a lesser rate, no doubt due to the decreased potency, but there was definitely more of it leaking out into his system. That could not be good in the blonde's opinion. Quickly he focused all his concentration of his prey to path. The effects were immediate, some of the cracks sealed themselves up and the leaking decreased. However, doing this was difficult and Naruto was visibly straining to do so. His will was absolute though, and he lessened the damage to the point the corridor was able to begin recovering from the damage. Quickly as he could while maintain his concentration, the monk wound his way through the representative passages of the seal. It was much easier to find the Kyuubi's room once he knew what he was looking for, and soon he was staring up at the enormous barred gate. However, the pipes weren't the only thing to change. The room had grown bigger. Instead of being a square, it was now a pentagon, and two of the enormous walls were taken up by equally large gates. The Kyuubi seemed to be in its usual position deep within the darkness of its own personal cell, the other one on the other hand. No. I was almost free. Yeeeeeaarrrggghhhhhhh. Naruto watched as an enormous tanuki comparable to the size of the Kyuubi, but slightly smaller, raged against the bars of its cage. It would slam its tail, arms and even head against the unyielding metal bars in an attempt to break free. All the while it would curse and scream loudly in increasing hysterics to the point where even the Kyuubi's eye was twitching in irritation. However, the sudden silence as Naruto entered the room was just as deafening. You. Suddenly the sand construct slammed both hands against the bars at once, its black and yellow eyes firmly fixed on the small figure before it. Father. Father. It's father. Father. It continued to repeat that over and over in increasingly hysterical tones, repeatedly banging against the bars at certain points. Be silent, you worthless tanuki. Suddenly the enormous mass of sand stopped, frozen in place as if each individual particle of sand had been replaced by ice. Slowly, inch by inch, it turned its colossal head to stare at the fox, red eyes meeting yellow. There was a moment of tense silence before Shukaku suddenly and without warning broke out into loud and high-pitched laughter, bouncing on its feet like a humored child. Yes, this is it. The mighty nine-tailed fox is locked in an itty-bitty cage. Not so mighty now, are you fuzzball? Again Shukaku broke out in hysterics as the Kyuubi growled out its irritation, unable to do anything thanks to the bars between them. Naruto watched on, unsure of whether to be amused or confused. In the end he settled in both. However, as he shifted, his shakuju once again jingled and he found Shukaku's attention completely on him. Father. Father is back. The enormous tanuki sidled up as close as he could to the cage, pressing its great head against the bars to peer even closer at Naruto. Shukaku knew you would come back, he said so, but the others didn't believe him. But you're here. You're really here. Suddenly the sand construct pressed its forehead up against the bars for a moment as Naruto looked on in confusion. After a moment it backed away, looking up at Naruto with expectant eyes. Naruto had once seen the same look in the eyes of a dog waiting for food. Almost as soon as they made eye contact, Shukaku reassumed the same position, with his forehead pressed right up against the bars. Naruto sent a small glance towards the Kyuubi, who only watched the whole spectacle with disdain. Unsure of what to do, Naruto cautiously made his way over towards the Ikibi's cell as the great creature continued to look up with excitement and expectant looks. Finally he was standing right before it, looking over the expansive sand plain of the Biju's forehead. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, he reached through the bars with one hand and began to gently rub Shukaku's sandy head. "Ah, I missed you, father." Naruto had never thought what it might sound like to hear a tanuki made of sand, the size of a building, sigh happily. He found out in that moment. After a moment or two it appeared the Ikibi had fallen asleep, and sure enough, when Naruto moved away the creature's chest was rising and falling steadily, a contented grin on its usually crazed features. The blonde walked away into the center of the room, looking at the Kyuubi as the fox cracked a single red eye at him. Do you know what that was about? The fox only huffed once, lazily rubbing its paw over its ear once before settling its head back down on its paws. Why does he keep calling me his father? The fox didn't answer even though Naruto could tell he was faking sleep, instead it just lay there. You know, I could always just ask Shukaku when it wakes up and not have to deal with you. Finally the Kyuubi reacted, snorting loudly in what could almost be mistaken for amusement, but was more than likely contempt. You would have better luck trying to hollow out the earth than get a straight answer from that insane tanuki ninja. The creature finally raised its head a little, staring directly at Naruto with unblinking red eyes. And for your information, Shukaku has somehow gotten it into his pitiful little insane mind that you are the sage. Naruto blinked at the information as he shifted his shakuju to his other hand absently, the action once again earning a twitch from the Kyuubi's ears out of his notice. It considers the Sage of the Six Paths his father. His only response was a single irritated growl before the Kyuubi lowered its head back down. Knowing when his tenant would be unresponsive, Naruto just gave a small sigh and disappeared from the seal. Naruto looked down at himself, pleasantly surprised to find his clothes had dried in the time he had been in the seal. He got up and doused the fire, quickly moving back onto the path to continue on his journey. After only 10 minutes of walking, he happened upon a small out-of-the-way village with a makeshift wooden wall surrounding it. It looked as though barricades and various fortifications had been hastily put up, and in many places the wall had been smashed down, large holes being slowly filled in by laboring villagers. As he walked further into the village, Naruto could feel the heavy presence of depression and general hopelessness weighing down on the people like a physical weight. All around him were signs of poverty, people out in the streets huddled underneath blankets, probably wearing everything they owned. Children ran through alleyways to the side of the street, their clothes tattered and their limbs skinny from malnourishment. He looked down as he felt a tug on the hem of his robes. Looking down, he saw a young girl who couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 staring up at him with large chocolate eyes. "Please, do you have any food?" Internally, Naruto was in disbelief about what he was seeing. On the outside though, he managed a small strained smile as he reached into a pouch, withdrawing a scroll. With a puff of smoke, he gave the young girl a loaf of bread which she just stared at as if it might disintegrate with a touch. Naruto gently pressed it into her hands and patted her lightly on the shoulder. Suddenly tears began leaking from the corners of her eyes as she wrapped her little arms as far around Naruto's waist as she could. "Thanks, mister." With that, she ran off towards a small group of kids around her age and began to share out the bread she had been given. However, she stopped when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Looking around, she saw Naruto looking down at their little group. "Please, allow me." With that, he continued to unseal the food he had gotten from stocking up in Suna, and soon each of the kids had a handful of food and were all looking up at him with wide eyes. After he had extradited himself from the enormous group glomp he had found himself in, Naruto began to continue his way through the small rundown village. "That was very kind of you, young man." He looked for the voice only to see an old woman looking up at him, sat against the side of a building. Her hair was graying and messy and her skin was covered in deep wrinkles, yet her eyes still had their youth in them, sparkling just as strongly as anybody. "I'm sure some of those boys and girls won't have eaten in a few days." Naruto walked over to the woman, his shakuju clicking against the cobbles lining the road. "What's going on in this village? What happened here?" The elderly woman just sighed as she looked upwards, watching the sky like it would rain money and food any second. "We used to be a thriving lumber town. Many merchants would pass through here between Hai no Kuni and Kei's no Kuni. However, the Wind Daimyo decided to build a highway through the country so that his travels would be shorter. Our little village was completely bypassed and was no longer the essential stop it had been. Business suffered for everybody, and soon we did not have enough money to fund a proper militia or defense. Then of course bandits came. They swooped down on us like a carrion bird picking at a dying animal, ravaging the town, stealing from everybody and even kidnapping many of the younger women from their families." As the woman spoke, Naruto's hand began to tighten around his staff, his knuckles turning white. "When did they last come through here?" The woman looked down to the ground, restlessly kneading her hands in the blanket thrown over her body. "Today, just a few hours ago, they took off east with a few girls from the village." Her voice was dejected and defeated. It was plain to Naruto that she had given up a long time ago along with the rest of the village. He began to walk away before he felt a hand grab his robes for the second time. The old woman was looking at him with saddened eyes. "You aren't planning to go after them, are you?" Naruto said nothing. Instead, he just stared a moment before turning and walking off. His feet carried him through the village faster than he normally would. There was something about their air of utter hopelessness in the village that struck a nerve deep within him. Before he knew it, he had begun walking east at a brisk pace, skirting around trees, not even entirely sure what he was doing. A part of him was thinking of going after the bandits, another was wondering how he would even find them. More importantly, he didn't know exactly what he would do when he finally reached them, if he did that was. Soon it began to rain, rather suddenly in fact, and Naruto quickly raised his hood, pulling his scarf up and around mouth to cover his whisker marks as his did so. The wind picked up a little, causing his cloak to flap around his body as he continued to walk forward at a steady pace. Surprisingly, it was the noise that told Naruto where the bandits were before his eyes caught even a glimpse of chakra. The raucous sounds of laughing, fighting, and drunken singing reached his ears even above the increasingly intense rain. It wasn't much longer after that when he found himself standing on a small ridge overlooking what was obviously the bandit camp. Fires were lit across the valley below, tents and makeshift cabins set up in circles around them. A loose wall was put up around the whole camp and the occasional guard patrolled the perimeter. Obviously they weren't expecting company anytime soon. Naruto would make sure to correct them on that. He continued straight over the ridge, approaching what appeared to be the main entrance to the camp. Two guards were lazily lounging on tree stumps, barely paying attention to the area around them until Naruto was close enough to smell the alcohol on their breaths. Hey you. One of the guards had obviously noticed the monk as he quickly scrambled for his weapon, a dull, rusty-looking sword that had obviously seen better days. What are you doing here? Get lost. His companion had been alerted by the guard's shouts and was also reaching for his own weapon, a naginata, in better condition than the sword going off its shinier metal. Naruto said nothing, just standing there with his face covered by the shadows of his hood and his cloak gently flapping in the wind. Despite his size, he made for an intimidating sight with his staff and dark cloak. Kaminari no Mai. With one sharp move, Naruto dug his shikuju into the soft earth, leaving it to stick out of the ground while he shifted into a loose taijutsu stance. His legs were shoulder-width apart while his arms hung limply at his sides, his head was tilted down, wet hair shadowing his eyes. Then, all in one moment, Naruto's head snapped up and his eyes opened, his ringed purple eyes glowing lightly with the chakra running through them. Both arms flipped up, palms cupped lightly as he almost seemed to gesture towards the guards. Bansho Tenin. Before they knew what was happening, the guards were in the air, moving quickly towards the still unmoving blonde. Before they reached him, his arms lowered, allowing them to come to a sliding stop, still just about on their feet. It didn't last long. Lighting fast, Naruto was between them, his body already spinning. Instead of punching, his arms seemed to just move with the momentum of his body, lashing out with pointed index and middle fingers. In a few seconds it was over. Naruto delivered a few fast jabs to nerve bundles across their bodies and they were on the floor, unmoving. Hey, what did you do to us? The bandits were on the ground, various muscles across their body twitching fruitlessly as they struggled to move. His voice was hoarse and he found it more difficult to speak than it should have been. Naruto didn't even glance in their direction, striding past them towards the camp. Kaminari no Mai is a taijutsu style that allows me to take advantage of an opponent's weaknesses. Their various blind spots and pressure points are all visible to my eyes. His eyes steeled over as he walked past them, cloak billowing in the rain. Watch my shikuju, I'll be back for it later. And with that he moved past them, taking long steps into the camp. Kaneko was feeling in particularly good spirits that night, despite the rain bearing down on them ever since their raid on the town earlier. They had food on their plates and money in their pouches. It made him wonder why they weren't raiding towns every night if the reward was so handsome. He laughed as Tadashi made a joke, managing to spit some food forward into the camp circle. The fire crackled brightly in their midst, bathing the area in a warm glow. Suddenly though, he felt something press against his neck, followed by a few light jabs along his spine. Unable to move, all of a sudden he fell limply to the fire, half his face getting covered in mud as he slumped to the ground. Out of the corner of his eye he spotted a cloaked figure move past him, descending upon his fellow bandits with the grace of a dancer yet the cold fury of a trained warrior. He would disable everybody with nothing more than a few jabs along key areas, spinning his body in strange and unpredictable directions until everybody was in a similar situation as him. The figure stopped for a moment, rolling one of the bandits he had subdued onto their back so they wouldn't suffocate in the mud. Kaneko just looked on in fear as the figure strode towards him. All he could see in the shadows cast by his hood were a pair of glowing purple eyes, ringed around the small pupil. To the terrified bandit it looked like death incarnate striding towards his petrified form. The assailant grabbed the bandit by his shirt, lifting him with surprising strength for his height and size. "Where do you keep your prisoners?" The voice that came out of the shadows of the hood was calm but had an edge like steel. Staring into those glowing eyes, the bandit just felt compelled to tell him. There. In the tents on the far side of the sea camp, I swear." The eyes narrowed for a moment before Kaneko was dropped to the ground, his limp body splashing in the mud. The man sighed deeply. Right now he felt truly lucky to be alive. Naruto walked through the bandit camp rather calmly, taking down any bandit that crossed his path swiftly. He may have only been 11, but he had chakra-enhanced speed and strength as well as his Rinnegan eyes, which made him more than a match for any number of untrained bandits. Quickly he dealt with the last of them, watching the man drop to the ground with cold, indifferent eyes. There were many things he was able to forgive thanks to his master's teachings, but kidnapping people, tearing them away from their life all for the sake of money or sick pleasures, that was not one of them. He ducked into one of the larger tents in the camp only for his hands to clench into fists so tight he began to draw blood with his fingernails. Around 20 women were tied up on the ground, their legs and arms bound at the wrists and ankles. Most were asleep or unconscious, Naruto couldn't tell, others were staring at him in fear, and all of them had the telltale signs they had been crying or were abused in some way. After calming himself down, he quickly went about untying the prisoners, in some cases just slashing through their bonds with a chakra-coated hand. "Okay, you're free. Go, the village is that way." He pointed back in the direction he had come from while the women just stared at him uncomprehendingly. Suddenly one of the girls at the back, around the same age Naruto was with long purple hair, stood up with a smile on her face. She wiped away the tears on her face with slightly weak arms as she looked around at her fellow prisoners. "You heard him, let's go." That seemed to rally the women as they all hurried from the tent, a few of them pausing outside to look at the unmoving bodies of the bandits strewn about. Did you kill them?" As if to answer, one of the men at her feet suddenly groaned, causing the woman to shriek and lash out on instinct with her foot, knocking him out. "No, I've paralyzed them all for about 6 hours. That should be enough time for the villagers to come out here and deal with them as they see fit." Naruto offered the collected girls a smile as he drew back his hood, uncaring of the rain flattening his spiky blonde locks. "I'm sorry this had to happen to you, but you're free now." Suddenly Naruto was swarmed on all sides by women, some thanking him profusely, others pulling him into vice-like hugs that left him a blushing wreck. One girl even kissed him before running off with a blush of her own after the retreating women. Once they were all gone, Naruto cast a glance around the bandit camp once again before walking off, grabbing his shakuju out of the ground along the way. Once he was back on the road, he turned north and just started walking, a smile playing across his lips. Chapter 10. Storm Part 2. Live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as if you were to live forever, Mahatma Gandhi. Kawa no Kuni was a large country, at least in comparison to the other so-called minor countries. While its economical income couldn't compare to its neighbor Konoha, it was by no means poor. With a border spanning between the lengths of Hai no Kuni and Kase no Kuni, it had exponentially prospered as an outcome of the peace between the two hidden villages. Trade routes through the country were developed, and places like Takumi Village and the now officially decommissioned Tanagakure became popular tourist hotspots. Its main export was lumber, similar to that of Hai no Kuni except where they provided bulk and quantity, Kawa no Kuni provided professionalism and quality. Expansive lumber farms of rare and sought-after trees spanned the length of the country. Taking advantage of the exhaustive river system that ran through the land, the lumber farms were able to float their cargo all the way to the port towns in the south of the country to be shipped off all around the elemental nations. Naruto stood by one such river, watching with idle interest as large barges filled to the brim with enormous logs of various color and shape floated by. Despite the hidden village of the country being officially disbanded in favor of services from whether Konoha or Suna, there were many guilds of mercenaries operating in the land. Most of the time they were contracted with protecting the barges from attack, however it rarely came to that. One barge of wood, no matter how rare, was fairly worthless to the average bandit. Naruto had been following the river for about an hour since leaving the women he had rescued to go back to their village. It was still raining heavily, causing the river to swell slightly. There was little chance of it breaking its banks, though most were reinforced against that kind of thing. Kawa no Kuni was a fairly flat land with only a few valleys towards the south of the region. The rivers that had their sources in Iwa's mountains by that point were lazy and meandering. There wasn't a single rapid or waterfall in the entire county. Floods used to be a fairly common occurrence, which was why many villages still bore the protection measures against such events, such as walls and special irrigation systems. However, the last daimyo, in an attempt to bolster the country's economical situation, had put a plan into action where every river in the country had been converted into a sort of semi-canal. It had nearly bankrupted the country, but the rewards were well worth it. No longer having to pay so much for flood protection, the people were freer to spend money on other things, contributing the economy more. Of course, Naruto didn't know any of this as he lazily made his way along the bank of the river, his hood up to ward off the rain. Every so often he would pause, an amused smile on his face before continuing on, the soft sound of raindrops and the lap of the river against its banks accompanying his walk. "Were you ever going to work up the courage to come out?" Naruto almost chuckled as he heard a startled "eep" from somewhere behind him, well, 2 trees behind him to be exact. He turned as a young girl sheepishly poked her head out from behind the large oak, a blush on her cheeks for getting caught. "How long did you know?" Naruto just gave a small smile as he leaned against his staff, surprising the girl when it didn't sink even an inch into the rain-softened ground. "What? That you were following me ever since the bandit camp?" The girl hung her head a little. In retrospect, she should have probably figured it would be hard to sneak up on somebody capable of taking down an entire bandit camp without a single casualty. I didn't mean to be sneaky or anything, I was just nervous." Naruto merely maintained his small smile. "Why didn't you go back to the village with the others?" Suddenly he recognized the girl. She was the one who rallied the others back in the camp. She had long flowing purple hair that was free to flow down her back in a wave and vibrant turquoise eyes. On her body was the tattered remains of what was once probably a rather pretty dress that was now covered in tears and dirt that was gradually being washed off by the rain. Well. She began to nervously wring her hands before looking up with a hopeful expression. "I want to learn how to do what you can." Naruto blinked in surprise before frowning as he noted the occasional shiver run across the girl's body. He was wrapped up in his cloak so he didn't notice, but thanks to the rain it had become rather cold. "Here." He removed his long billowing cloak, allowing the girl to see the monk robes he wore underneath, before holding it out to her. Immediately his hair was flattened against his head and his clothes began to soak, but he quickly circulated fire chakra through his body for warmth. The girl just looked hesitantly at the cloak before accepting it with a gracious smile. "Thank you, I'm Shizuku by the way." Naruto cocked a brow. It was a fairly unusual name, especially for a girl. "Naruto, that's a strange name." The girl blushed again as she pulled the large cloak over her considerably smaller frame. "Yeah, it was given to me by the lady who ran the orphanage." She looked up and saw Naruto's sympathetic look, which only seemed to redden her blush. "I don't know what happened to my parents, but I was found as a child unconscious in front of the village. I don't remember anything before then." Naruto gave her an understanding smile as he moved closer, bringing the both of them underneath the protection of a large bough. "I was an orphan too. I ran away from my village when I was young." He paused for a moment, looking like he was going to say more but thought better of it. "I was found a few days later by my senpai Chiriku and lived in the fire temple ever since." Shizuku finally seemed to notice the boy's staff and robes as her eyes widened in understanding. "So, you're really a monk?" Naruto nodded once and the girl slumped slightly against the tree. "Wow, I thought you must be a ninja or something from the way you took down those bandits." She looked at him incredulously for a moment, her long purple hair splaying across her face as it moved with the momentum of her head. "Aren't monks just supposed to go about preaching and praying or something?" Naruto gave a short laugh as he sat down on the wet ground. He was wet anyway, so a bit more wouldn't hurt. "I get that a lot. Monks and shinobi both develop the use of chakra within their bodies, however the difference lays in their goals. Shinobi train purely to fight or to aid in fighting so they can complete their missions and get paid. Monks train to use chakra so they can better understand themselves, however this requires both mental and physical training. Learning taijutsu is the easiest way to go about this." Shizuku nodded dumbly, only really following half of that. "But the way you took down those bandits." Naruto stood up, quickly walking up the tree they were next to, which was amazing enough as it was. He proceeded to rip a rather large branch from the tree with obvious ease before dropping back down with no visible injury. Understanding chakra and learning to mold it gives one certain advantages like enhanced strength and speed, but it is only a byproduct of our training. In a fight with a trained ninja, the monk will more often than not come out the worse for it. Shizuku looked down, disappointed by that slightly. Naruto caught that as he sat back down. This time the girl joined him. But why do you wish to learn what I can do? The blonde was mildly surprised when he saw a look of intense determination flash across the girl's teal eyes. Her fists clenched slightly as she looked off into the trees, obviously thinking deeply about something. I felt so hopeless, lying there in that tent, unable to help or do anything. I had to watch as girls were dragged off, to only be abused for the sick pleasure of those men. I wanted so desperately to help, to do something other than just lie there hopelessly. Then you came along, framed by the light in the flap of the tent. You looked so. She suddenly trailed off as a large blush once again flooded her face, forcing her to look away before coughing. You seemed so strong and powerful. She turned back to face him. I want to be like that too, so I never have to watch on powerlessly again as people are hurt. She was greeted by a warm smile from the blonde. That is a very good reason to seek power, but what then? What will you do when you have that power? The girl looked at him confused as the blonde sighed, a contemplative look replacing his usual serene smile. My master once told me that some of the worst people in the world do what they do out of love. Again he only received a look of confusion. If you loved somebody so intently you would give your life for them only to watch them die in front of you, naturally you would seek revenge. The road to damnation is paved with more than good intentions but the bones of people one steps over in their warped quest. He blinked as he looked around, the warm smile returning to his face as soon as he realized it was gone. Sorry, guess I got a little carried away there. Shizuku just looked at him with wide eyes, her mouth hanging open a little almost comically. Are all monks like you? Naruto chuckled at that, a grin stretching over his face. There's nobody like me. The girl blinked before a similar smile began to spread over her own features. So will you do it? The blonde raised an eyebrow causing the girl to sigh. Will you teach me how to be stronger? Naruto chuckled as he nodded understandingly. He seemed pensive for a moment as he slowly got to his feet. There was a long moment of silence as he stared at the end of his staff, seemingly lost in his thoughts. No. Shizuku nearly fell over at that before looking down sadly. I understand. She turned to go, shrugging off the cloak only to feel a hand on her shoulder preventing her. Turning with confusion she saw Naruto standing there with a half smile, his other hand extended towards her. I can't teach you how to be stronger, that is something you must figure out yourself, but as my master told me 4 years ago, I can give you the tool to find that answer. Naruto had never felt wiser in his life, he almost felt like Chukaku when he gave one of his sagely lectures. Of course the mood was completely ruined when Shizuku suddenly launched herself forward, wrapping her arms tightly around the blonde in a warm hug. Thank you. I promise you won't regret this, I'll be the best student ever. Naruto smiled warmly as he began to walk again, Shizuku scrambling to follow him. So does this make me like your apprentice now? Naruto chuckled lightly as he walked, Shikuju jingling melodiously for a moment as he turned to look at his new traveling companion. I suppose so. Alright, the first thing you need to learn about chakra is that you cannot control it. Naruto's new student stared at him incredulously for a moment. They had stopped off for the night somewhere in the north of the country, not too far from the border between Kawa and Aim no Kuni. They sat in a clearing, a small fire burning between them to dry them off. The rain hadn't stopped but the small clearing acted like a natural shelter, keeping them dry for the most part. What do you mean, don't ninja use it to do all their cool jutsu and stuff? Naruto just chuckled, running a hand through his damp hair before replacing them in front of the fire to keep warm. Using fire chakra was handy but doing it consistently throughout the day became tiring, even to somebody like Naruto. It is true shinobi use chakra to perform ninjutsu, however they do not control the chakra running through their body, they merely guide it, or at least the most successful do. You have to imagine it like water, you can try to pick it up all you like but it will just run through your fingers eventually, instead you make channels for the water and allow it to flow naturally. The only part a shinobi actively plays is molding the chakra itself from their physical and spiritual energies. At this point Shizuku had her head tilted to the side like a lost puppy, causing Naruto to sigh with a small smile. Come here. The girl blinked but complied anyway, walking around the campfire to stand in front of Naruto. The blonde surprised her however when he gently pressed his palm against her stomach, causing an intense blush to break out across her face. What are you? Shizuku suddenly stopped as she felt a warmth suddenly enter her body through the contact like a liquid spreading throughout her form. She suddenly felt incredibly strong and her senses were heightened to levels she wouldn't have believed before. As suddenly as it had happened it was gone, Naruto pulling his hand away much to the girl's disappointment. That was chakra. Naruto's words didn't seem to reach the girl, she had a lopsided grin on her face and was swaying slightly. Can you do that again? Naruto chuckled slightly as he patted the spot on the log next to him, the girl sitting down without hesitance. I don't need to, soon you'll be able to do that yourself. I might have lied just a bit, you can control chakra to an extent but not in the way you would think. Naturally there is always chakra flowing in our bodies, through special pathways just for that purpose. In most people these routes are underdeveloped so not much is flowing. In ninja they work for years in order to develop these pathways so they can perform their techniques. What I just did was guide some of my own chakra through your chakra network, opening them up slightly and encouraging your own core to begin producing more. This will start a chain reaction of sorts so that if you continue to train your pathways will continue to expand. Naruto looked over only to see Shizuku with her head tilted forward, her eyes slowly closing. He just smiled as he led her carefully over to where he had unsealed his sleeping mat. He lay down a few meters away on the ground, not minding the soft earth as a bed, he had certainly slept on worse. He figured it was better she slept now. Loosening one's pathways manually was an uncomfortable process but this way she would sleep through it. He looked over one more time at the sheet of purple hair poking out from underneath the blanket, he had gained some company if nothing else. So where are we headed then? The two were walking through thick forests again having woken some time after the sun had rose. Well, Naruto had been awake the moment the sun peeked through the trees, preparing breakfast before meditating until his new companion awoke. It was a novel experience having to explain to the girl what meditation was and what it did. She had attempted it however briefly but found it to be boring, it was like seeing a glimpse of himself in the past. Wherever our feet take us I suppose. The Violette stared at the blonde for a moment before shaking her head with a sigh. Is everything you say going to be a riddle? Her response was a warm smile which only increased the volume of her groan. Well, if we went via the elemental cycle I started in Hai no Kuni before traveling to Kase no Kuni, so the next logical destination would be Kaminari no Kuni. If anything the girl's disbelief only increased as she stared at her companion in horror. Are you kidding? The land of lightning is on the other side of the continent. Naruto just shrugged with that same calming, yet unbelievably irritating smile. Peace is a journey of 1,000 miles and must be taken one step at a time. Again Shizuku just blinked before hanging her head down, an invisible rain cloud hanging over her head. You're impossible. Of course while the rain cloud over her head was imaginary, the ones in the sky were very much real. As far as Naruto could tell it hadn't stopped raining all night and had continued to do so into the morning. Naruto just chuckled at her response as they continued to walk in silence, only the jingle of his staff breaking the quiet. Where would you suggest we go then? Shizuku gave a small laugh of her own, her emotions doing a complete 180 as she motioned to her tattered clothing. A town preferably, if I'm going to be traveling all the way to Kaminari no Kuni then I'll need some new clothes. Naruto gave a small conceding nod, pleasantly surprised at how quickly the girl's disposition had taken a turn for the better. It was something he had noticed about the girl, no matter what happened she seemed to bounce back within moments to what appeared to be her usual upbeat attitude. Pretty soon they did reach a town, one that straddled the edge of the border with Aim no Kuni. Thankfully it was not as downtrodden as the last one Naruto passed through, people were going about their normal days without a care. Not much attention was given to a traveling monk and the young girl with him and Naruto liked it better that way. He normally wouldn't mind any attention he might attract because he was at least confident in his skills. However now there was somebody with him he couldn't be so sure, he felt protective of Shizuku. Due to the inherent radar all women naturally possessed it didn't take all that long for the girl to find a clothes shop. Naruto gave her some money out of the small amount he had saved over his time in Suna and left her to get what she needed. He wasn't sure why but he felt as though if he went inside he would end up regretting it. However, as soon as the girl came back out, he instantly knew he should have gone in with her. What are you wearing? Naruto blinked in surprise once as his head tilted to the side in surprise. Shizuku had emerged from the shop with what very well appeared to be a Miko outfit, complete with the clean white kimono top tucked into a traditional red hakama. She also had decided to take a leaf out of Naruto's book, buying comfortable strap-up sandals with white socks unlike the open-toed style favored by ninja. Her hair was now tied back by a light ribbon the same color as her eyes, drawing it into a long ponytail. Honestly, Naruto wouldn't have been surprised if there had been a sword on her back, thankfully there wasn't. What, you don't like it? I figured if I'm traveling with a monk I should look the part. Naruto just rubbed his forehead, unsure of whether to be flattered by the girl's commitment or just irritated. You're mistaking me for a priest again. Shizuku just blinked in confusion, almost melting away Naruto's irritation with how cute the action was. I am. That was the final straw. Shizuku tilted her head to the side slightly with wide blinking eyes, her ponytail falling with it. Naruto somehow knew she knew exactly what she was doing, but it was too damn cute, so he didn't find it in him to care. It's fine, as long as you bought something else then. The monk blanched as Shizuku produced 3 more sets of the exact same outfit from behind her. His head fell forward in defeat while Shizuku had that same innocent smile on her face. Come on then, I'll show you how to seal those away in scrolls. Shizuku's face lit up at the mention of learning something. On their walk they had talked a lot about what Naruto would teach her, or at least Shizuku had excitedly speculated while Naruto watched on in amusement. They began to move on, grabbing something to eat while they were in the town before moving on to the border. Naruto was wary at this point. Aim no Kuni was very mysterious as of late. Chiriku had even warned him about passing through there. The borders were apparently heavily watched and Omegakure itself was supposed to be impossible to enter at the moment. People speculated there was some kind of internal strife going on, like a civil war, which was surprising. The leader of AIM, Hanzo of the Salamander, was said to have defeated all 3 of Konoha's Sannin at the same time. However, despite all of this, it took surprisingly little effort to get into the country itself. It turns out all kinds of holy men were pretty much ignored as they traveled from country to country, considered harmless by most. Even if a monk or priest had power or skill, they were pacifists by nature, so posed no direct danger to anybody. There was also the fact that AIM was secure in the knowledge Omegakure had never been invaded before outside of war. It continued to rain as they traveled, so they had to find a cave some way off from the main road before they could make camp. Naruto quickly made a fire and soon the two were drying themselves off. Shizuku was also admiring her new look in a nearby puddle, but that wasn't relevant. The atmosphere was surprisingly quiet considering how talkative Shizuku normally was. After they had dried off, she sat at the mouth of the cave just staring out into the rain. Naruto joined her after a while, sitting next to her and peering out into the sheets of falling water. It's been raining pretty heavily for a while. Now hasn't it? The blonde blinked when he noticed his companion's head droop slightly, an air of depression settling over her. He had only tried to make conversation, yet Shizuku seemed to withdraw upon herself as he said it. It's my fault. He looked over only to be surprised when he saw Shizuku with tears bristling in the corners of her eyes. Naruto may have been a monk, but he was still a guy, and there are only a few reactions when a boy is faced with a crying girl. Whoa, hey, it's not your fault. He began to wave his hands in front of himself for reasons he couldn't quite fathom on a conscious level. Hey, it's raining, so what? We're in Aim no Kuni, so what do you expect? In response, Shizuku just tucked her legs up against her chest, wrapping her arms around her knees and burying her face in her new hakama leggings. It's not that. Everywhere I go the rain always seems to follow me. It's how I got my name. For as long as I can remember, whenever I am outside it would always rain. The other kids would stay away from me, saying I was cursed or just bad luck. Now I've brought that on you, I'm sorry. She withdrew on herself even further, listening to the individual sounds of raindrops falling on the ground outside. She didn't flinch when she felt a warm hand rest on her shoulder. She didn't even look up. You know, a very wise old man once told me that the rain helps us see just how insignificant our own problems are. When you can walk outside as water falls from the sky, mingling with your tears to the point where they become indistinguishable, you realize that right at that very moment you might not be the only person in the world crying, and you just might not be able to see them. Shizuku looked up slowly from her knees, timidly turning her gaze towards Naruto. However, the blonde wasn't looking at her, he was staring out of the cave into the rain. Suddenly he stood up and walked outside, completely uncaring of the water drenching his body. Lightning flashed briefly behind him, framing his body with light for a single second. He turned with a beaming smile, his hand outstretched in Shizuku's direction, gesturing for her to join him. Tentatively she stood and ventured out into the rain, her steps growing more confident as she reached the blonde. He took her hand, smiling all the while as he looked up at the overcast sky. "I'll make you a promise. Shizuku is my first apprentice. As long as I'm with you, you will never have to hide your tears in the rain again." With that he raised a single hand, his eyes opening, giving Shizuku her first ever glimpse of the Rinnegan. She felt a sudden surge of unexplained energy through the contact between their hands. Shinra Tensei. Suddenly, just like that, the rain stopped. It wasn't so much that it stopped falling entirely, but above the two of them the water was suspended in the air like it was being held back by some great invisible hand. Shizuku could only watch and wonder at the physics-defying event taking place above her as Naruto defied nature to stop the rain falling. She looked back around only to find herself looking directly into Naruto's steely purple eyes. Suddenly Naruto's technique gave out and the rain began to fall again, succinctly drenching them both from all the held-back water. Quickly hurrying back into the cave, the two began to laugh at the situation before settling down next to the fire to once again dry off. However, every couple of moments or so Shizuku would cast a glance Naruto's way, trying to explain what she had felt out there, looking into his eyes. "So the rain has really always followed you?" Shizuku looked up to see Naruto looking at her, his eyes once again narrowed as they usually were and only a small smile adoring his features. Shizuku just nodded while Naruto became thoughtful. He looked at her again, opening his eyes slightly wider to once again reveal his dujutsu, staring at her as if he could see right through her. For a moment his eyes narrowed in confusion before they went back to normal. "Your eyes, I've never seen anything like them." Naruto chuckled nervously as he rubbed the back of his neck. Shizuku was glad for moments like that, they humanized the otherwise mysterious monk she had latched herself onto. "Yeah, I guess you could say they're unique." Upon Shizuku's look of interest the blonde sighed before opening his eyes completely, abandoning his usual narrowed look for now. "I have a bloodline of sorts that manifests in my eyes as a dujutsu known as the Rinnegan. It allows me to do things that others can't." Shizuku just stared at him strangely before her eyes widened in understanding as she looked out at the rain. "Yes, the technique you saw me use was one of the 6 paths my eyes grant me access to, the Diva path, which grants me limited control over gravity." At this point Shizuku was staring at him with wide, gleaming eyes. She had known ninja were capable of amazing feats, but to be able to control one of the fundamental forces of the universe. "What are the other paths?" Naruto sighed with a small smile. "You've actually seen me use another, the Preta path. It allows me control over how chakra moves, so I can absorb it or direct it into objects or people. It was how I begun to get your pathways to open up manually. Other than that I'm not sure, there isn't a lot of information available to help me find out." Shizuku nodded in understanding before frowning. "Then how do you know there are 6 paths?" Naruto grinned as he instinctively reached for his shikuju, taking comfort in the feel of the firm staff. "The monks at the temple I lived in showed me some books about a man called the Sage of the 6 Paths. He too is said to have possessed the Rinnegan, but so little is known about him because he lived hundreds of years ago. I don't know if I will ever unlock all the abilities of the Rinnegan, but they seem to manifest at points where I am in need or desperate." He shrugged, returning to his more nonchalant demeanor. "But enough delaying, it's about time we worked on your chakra control." Shizuku's groan echoed around the small cave. It was still raining and Naruto had begun to take Shizuku's story seriously, then again he couldn't be sure if it had more to do with them being in Aim no Kuni. It had been a long and rather exhausting journey through the country, mostly due to the fact they had avoided any villages or towns they had encountered. After the first one they learned that Aim was currently embroiled in a rather vicious civil war. Nobody said it outright but the signs were all there. Even in that one town people had been driven into factions. There were the loyalists to Hanzo of the Salamander. These people were either terrified of the man and his followers or genuinely believed the leader of Aim was right for the country. It was true that after the Third Shinobi War Aim had been left in a state of poverty and disrepair, Ever since then Hanzo had worked to restore the country to what it had once been. Though there were the rebels, they were much harder to spot, for obvious reasons, but their presence was no less noticeable. Propaganda posters littered the walls, many covered in the same red cloud decal that seemed to be a symbol for the rebellion. It was hushed as much as possible by the loyalists. They tore down any posters in sight and brought any suspected rebel in for questioning. These were the people who believed either Hanzo wasn't a good leader or he wasn't doing things fast enough. That wasn't what made Naruto cautious, it was seeing a certain woman that had done that. They had been walking down the street in the first town they came across after buying some provisions when a woman walked past them. She had been wearing a black cloak with red clouds adorning it, a blatant sign of the rebellion, and yet nobody did anything. People went out of their way to avoid the blue-hair woman and Naruto knew why. She practically radiated power, at least in comparison to the surrounding people. Even under Naruto's Rinnegan eye he could get nothing. Like with Gaara, a thin layer of chakra covered her entire body, making anything else difficult to discern. After that the two had avoided any major villages or towns, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire of the brewing civil unrest. Naruto would have gladly offered his help, but people who got mixed up in wars were targeted. When those targeted people couldn't be hurt they began to go after people close to them. Naruto had made a promise to Shizuku that he had no intention of breaking, he would protect her. So they quickly made their way north through the impoverished country. Naruto was relieved to finally see the border to Kusa no Kuni. Chapter 11, Storm Part 3. The roots of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet. Aristotle. In comparison to entering the country, leaving proved to be far more of a chore. The two of them had been checked for any contraband, which Naruto knew to mean any signs of rebel influence. It had taken a good hour before they were cleared to finally leave and cross over into Kusa no Kuni. Unfortunately for them, despite leaving the land of rain, the clouds overhead made no attempt to dissipate. Shizuku's mood seemed somber after that. Naruto had never taken much stock in borders between countries, they were mostly artificial anyway, only really being true on maps. However, the difference between Aim and Kusa was almost strangely apparent. No sooner were they out of the relatively flat and barren country behind them before they found themselves walking through a large, jungle-esque area. Everything from the plants to the animals seemed vastly oversized. Mushrooms the size of small buildings seemed especially prevalent. Another strange thing was that there seemed to be no obvious roads anywhere, they seemed to stop right at the border with Aim. This left them to trek through the jungle with only a small map to tell them the way. Naruto was never sure why, although he suspected it had to do with his Diva Path's gravity abilities, but he always had an innate sense of direction, he just instinctively knew which way was north and such. That proved helpful when the sky overhead became blotted out by the thick canopy of jungle foliage and they couldn't even tell where the sun was. However, this had the added benefit of blocking the rain, which lightened the mood for the both of them, although they could have done without the rather oppressive jungle heat. Along that line the two had abandoned the raincoats they had picked up in Aim in favor of their lighter attire, Naruto in his robes and Shizuku in her Miko outfit. However, they decided to keep the Sugagasa hats they had picked up. Naruto liked the look of them and they kept the upper half of his face hidden, meaning he could keep his eyes open without anybody seeing them. You know, as a monk I'm supposed to be in tune with nature and the animals around me. Shizuku was quietly giggling to herself as Naruto held his hands in fists, the one around his shakuju turning white. But that would be a whole lot easier without all of these bugs. As if to prove his point, a rather large and lazy-looking fly landed on Naruto's outstretched arm. The blonde was physically restraining himself to not just slam his other hand down on it. The jingle of a monk's shakuju was for the express purpose of warning insects and bugs away from him so he would not step on them. Unfortunately, they did not seem to be getting the message. I have no idea what you mean. Her voice was calm, but Shizuku still had her hand across her mouth to suppress her giggles. Naruto had been getting more and more irritable the further they got into Kusa, far from the usual serene monk persona he normally wore. Naruto just cast her a rather pointed glance, his eyes momentarily flaring with chakra to light up his Rinnegan. Why isn't this happening to you? The girl just shrugged. Honestly, she too had thought it was rather strange that not a single insect had come anywhere near her since arriving in the country. I don't know, I guess animals just like me better. Naruto just gritted his teeth as he shook off yet another bloodsucker looking for its next free meal. He sighed irritably as he noticed the area around them growing darker. No doubt the sun was going down, not that they could see it. Alright, well we might as well stop for the night anyway. At that Shizuku froze, looking at Naruto with wide eyes before turning that same frightened gaze around her. Here, as in the middle of the jungle. Naruto nodded absently as he began the process of unsealing all of their equipment and supplies. Are you kidding? Did you see the size of some of the animals we passed? Naruto quickly waved her off with a smile as he continued to lay out the 2 sleeping mats they had. He had made sure to pick up a second one during their trip through AIM. Don't worry, this is the perfect opportunity for me to try something out. Her anxiety being replaced by curiosity for the moment, Shizuku calmed down and looked at her blonde companion in interest. What? Naruto just cast her a quick smile she knew meant he was either planning something or wanted to keep it a surprise. He settled down into his usual meditative position and began seeping his chakra into the ground. Then, with all the control he could muster, he began to raise his arm, and to Shizuku's amazement, the ground around them began to break down, quickly replaced by fine golden sand. His face scrunched up in concentration. The blonde raised his other hand up, as if obeying orders. The sand began to move, circling the pair until it formed a makeshift hut. Phew, I don't know how Gaara did that with such ease. He was nearly tackled off his feet when he stood up only to have Shizuku run at him, grabbing onto his shoulders and looking at him with wide eyes. That was so cool. Can you teach me that? Naruto chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his head as he sat back down, Shizuku descending with him onto her knees. Not really. The girl's face fell, which made the blonde's heart clench slightly at the sight. Oh, is it one of your Rinnegan abilities? Naruto quickly shook his head only to earn a look of intense confusion from his female companion. No, actually it's something I picked up from a friend of mine, Gaara from Suna. Shizuku just frowned, poking at the walls of the makeshift hut to find them surprisingly strong and unyielding. Well, if you picked it up, why can't I? Do you not think I'm good enough? Again Naruto found himself faced by a girl on the verge of tears and once again found his arms flailing out in front of him for no discernible reason. No, nothing like that, it's just, well, it's complicated. He looked down a bit at that. It sounded like a rather pathetic excuse and Shizuku seemed to agree. What do you mean complicated? Naruto opened his mouth to speak but nothing came. He closed it with a frown before repeating this 3 times. He looked over at Shizuku. He wasn't sure if he was ready to tell the girl about his tenant. However, as soon as he looked at her, he saw that moment when she was sitting in the cave, rain pouring down in front of her as she curled in on herself. With a soft sigh, his eyes lightened slightly and she turned back to look at her again. Have you ever heard of the Biju? Wow. Shizuku just sat there, shocked at everything she had heard. She might have thought it was a joke if Naruto hadn't been so serious as he talked. Are you alright? The Violette just nodded dumbly, her eyes unfocused as she tried to process it all. It sounded so fantastical. Her friend contained the most powerful demon in the world, and now another one too if his story was anything to go on. Yeah, it's just a lot to take in. Naruto nodded sympathetically. It was shocking enough when he had been told. Finally though, the girl seemed to snap out of it, looking around the sand hut with renewed awe. So you can do all this with sand because of that second demon inside of you, Shukaku. Naruto quickly nodded, waving his hand to a small pillar of sand grew between them to demonstrate. Yes, the previous host was also able to do it too, but to a greater degree and with much more ease. Although that was probably due to the fact he had his entire life to practice, this is still fairly new to me. Also, calling them demons is probably incorrect. They are just beings made entirely of chakra. Biju would be the correct term. Shizuku stopped her odd gazing as she swiveled in place, looking at Naruto with a raised eyebrow. Tailed beast. Isn't that just as negative? Naruto blinked at that before looking down with a frown. She did have a point after all. Unfortunately, that is the only thing I can call them. Anything else and people wouldn't know what I was talking about. Shizuku sighed but nodded all the same. Her hands began idly playing with the sand on the ground, drawing absent patterns with her fingers. I wonder what that would be like, to be locked up inside of somebody just because you are powerful and feared. It just sounds so unfair. I mean, like you said, they can think right. No intelligent animal should have to be caged up like that against their will. The blonde just stared at her for a moment, surprised but smiling all the same. Well, the Kyuubi certainly doesn't make itself easy to talk to it, it's an uphill battle with that fox. Shizuku giggled at that. The thought of Naruto acting so flippant about such a powerful being was a rather amusing thought. Anyway, it's about time we get onto your chakra exercises. Shizuku's laugh immediately turned into a drawn-out groan and it was Naruto's turn to chuckle. Those don't sound like the noises of the best student ever, he laughed again as she just looked at him with a deadpan expression before her head slumped forwards. It's just so boring though, can't we do something else for once, like learn how to manipulate fire or wind? Naruto put his finger under his chin in a thoughtful expression as Shizuku's gaze turned hopeful. No. Her head immediately fell again and Naruto could have sworn the sounds of rain above them actually increased for a moment. You need chakra to do those things and right now you still haven't managed to find yours. The blonde was moderately surprised as his friend's head shot up, a determined expression across her firm features as she pulled herself into a relaxed cross-legged pose. I'll do it this time. She closed her eyes as a look of intense concentration appeared on her face, crinkling her brow as her tongue started to poke from the corner of her mouth. Naruto sat against the wall of his self-made hut, watching the girl carefully, noticing no change in her chakra whatsoever. After about 5 minutes, Shizuku's shoulders slumped forward and she let out a long drawn-out breath. This is impossible, how am I supposed to find my chakra when I don't even know what I'm looking for? Naruto sighed for a moment before looking up with what he hoped was an encouraging smile. You have to look deep within yourself until you find that tiny spark of warmth. You have to lock onto it and concentrate hard, fanning that spark until it becomes a small flame. Shizuku still looked dejected and for good reason. Naruto had already told her all this before and she still could not find what he was telling her to look for. The blonde thought for a moment, perhaps he was just going about this the wrong way. Tell you what, if you manage to find your chakra tonight, I promise that tomorrow I will teach you how to climb trees without your hands. Shizuku's head shot up, stars twinkling in her eyes as she remembered how Naruto had introduced her to the concepts of chakra in the first place. Once again a determined look crossed her face, however this time she tried to get into a proper meditative position like she had seen Naruto do so many times. The blonde was mildly impressed, her posture was a little off but it was a close approximation. Deciding to get his own time in while he could, he got into the correct position, closing his eyes as he allowed his mind to clear. Father's back. Naruto couldn't help the small smile that broke on his face as he heard the ever-excitable voice of Shukaku break through the calm of the seal. Quiet, you pitiful tanuki, that mere ninja is and never will be the sage, so be silent before I end your pathetic ramblings myself. And of course Naruto immediately sighed as the Kyuubi's angry retort once again plunged the seal into silence. It is good to see the both of you as well. The Kyuubi had become a lot more irritable since Shukaku had been added to the seal. As far as he understood, the two couldn't actually interact on a regular basis. When Naruto wasn't in the seal, their individual cells separated, or at least that was the impression he got from Kyuubi's contemptuous statements. However, Naruto came into the seal quite regularly and thanks to the fox's intense disdain for his fellow Biju, that was enough to set him on edge. Quiet ninja, you are just as pathetic for never denying Shukaku of his insane delusions. Naruto once again sighed. This was how it would always go. He would enter the seal, Shukaku would greet him and the Kyuubi would have some scathing comment that would immediately induce the tanuki into a fit of rage. Sure enough, not a moment later Shukaku began angrily banging on the bars of its cage, thrashing against the reinforced metal with its whole body. Brother shouldn't say that. Father will get mad at you and then you'll be punished. The Kyuubi merely grunted in annoyance before laying its giant head back down on its paws, ignoring the enraged cries of its fellow Biju. Og. Don't ignore me, fox. The best he got was a small twitch of the Kyuubi's ears, causing the sand construct to let out another murderous cry. Naruto sat there in the middle of the room, just watching as the Ikibi vented its frustrations against the bars of its cage. Suddenly its ear twitched and it looked around, its eyes quickly settling on Naruto as it inched its face closer to the bars. Father should tell the fox, father should punish the fox. You are father, you have to be father, you have father's eyes and father's staff and father's hair and father's eyes, and I bet you have father's other possessions too. Naruto suddenly blinked in surprise at that. He had known about the sage's legendary artifacts before, but he had never had a clear answer what they were. Between the Biju's insane attitude and almost sycophantic worship, he forgot that, like the Kyuubi, it too must have known. The sage. Shukaku, remind me about my possessions. Out of the corner of his eye, Naruto saw the Kyuubi crack open a single eye and glare at him. He was obviously affronted Naruto would actually impersonate the sage just to get answers, however there was nothing he could do. Shukaku on the other hand practically preened, glad to be of help to the one he saw as his progenitor. Of course. There was father's necklace, it was shiny and red, there were father's pots, you told us to stay away from those or we might get hurt because father was nice and he cared. Father had a sword too, but he never cut people with it. Shukaku never understood why, but father would pat Shukaku on the head when he asked. There was also. The Biju gained a look of intense concentration which might have amused Naruto if he wasn't so interested right now. The look of happiness as realization dawned on its great face might have been amusing in another situation. The rope. Father had that gold rope. It nodded once in satisfaction as its enormous tail swayed back and forth behind it contentedly. It peered down at Naruto with yellow eyes, expectation apparent on its sandy face before it leaned down. Knowing what to do now, Naruto quickly walked over and scratched the enormous sand construct on the head. It let out a massive sigh that shook the bars of the cage slightly as it slumped onto one side. Naruto almost expected its giant foot to start twitching in pleasure, but thankfully it didn't. Naruto didn't think he would be able to get that image out of his head. You did good, Shukaku. If anything, the great creature's look of contentment increased before soft but still bone-shaking snores reverberated around the seal. How pitiful, using his insanity for your mindless questions, or you that depraved ninja. Naruto looked over and gave the great fox a small smile, although there was a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. I have to use the resources available to me, although its descriptions were rather vague. He looked up, not entirely expecting a positive answer to his question. Any help on that front? The Kyuubi just snorted, once again blowing a gust of warm air over the blonde, causing his robes to move in the breeze. Why, surely you have your loyal lapdog now. What possible use could I be, ninja? Naruto gave a small sigh as he returned to the center of the chamber, sliding down into a relaxed sitting position. My name is still Naruto. At that he could have sworn he saw the great fox roll its slitted red eye, but it may have been a trick of the light. How wonderful for you. Again Naruto could only sigh at the Kyuubi rebuking his attempts at engaging the great creature in meaningful conversation. Just leave so I can have my lonely cell back, it is better than listening to that blasted tanuki snore. Naruto gave a conceding nod before fading from the seal, allowing the Kyuubi to watch as the other cage vanished as well, once again returning him to his solitude. Naruto. The blonde's eyes shot open, searching around frantically for the danger as he heard his name being called. What is it? He blinked as he saw Shizuku a few inches in front of him, waving her hand in front of him. She stopped when she saw his eyes open before blushing and moving back when she realized how close they had been. You wouldn't wake up when I called. Naruto ran a hand through his hair as he leaned back into a more comfortable position, accidentally nudging his staff as he put his hands back. Sorry, I was talking to them. Shizuku's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly shook her head of it. Naruto, I did it. The blonde blinked in surprise before a fox-like grin spread across his face. That's great. Shizuku beamed at the praise, her eyes closed. As she basked in it for a moment. Yeah, I found that spark you were talking about then, just like that time you showed me. I felt that warm feeling in my body. Shizuku felt amazing, her senses felt more alert than ever and she felt as though she could run miles without getting tired. It was as though she could feel the new energy coursing through her body like little streams of warm water. You didn't tell me it felt so amazing. Naruto just tilted his head slightly with a small nostalgic smile. I wouldn't really know, because of the Kyuubi constantly dripping its chakra into my system. I've always had it, I don't know what it's like not to. Suddenly his smile turned into a confused frown as he looked over his companion, a blush suddenly alighting on the bridge of his nose. Shizuku, did you go outside or something? The girl blinked in surprise as she looked out of the hut before back to the blonde. No, why? Naruto looked away for a moment, the blush intensifying as she moved. Your clothes and hair are wet. The girl blinked again before looking down. Sure enough, her skin had a thin sheen on moisture and her decidedly thin clothes were plastered against her body. Her eyes widened as she immediately threw her arms over her chest. She may have only been 11, but there were already signs of her becoming a woman. Ah, what the hell? Is this supposed to happen? Naruto just ran through his thoughts in confusion. He had never read anything about this happening at the temple. I don't know, here let me. He trailed off as he opened his eyes, examining the girl with his Rinnegan. His blush spread slightly but it quickly disappeared as he frowned. Hey, your chakra changed and it's flowing differently. Shizuku was still covering her chest as she inched closer to the fire in order to dry off. Strangely, she noted that the heat seemed more uncomfortable than usual. She looked up at Naruto strangely, wondering what exactly he saw through those eyes of his. What do you mean different? Naruto just peered closer, which made the girl feel decidedly uncomfortable. It was like he was looking through her instead of at her. I'm not sure, your chakra used to be light blue like most people's, they all look different but it's only slight. Now yours looks like a much darker blue and instead of flowing erratically it's moving more calmly like water, or at least that's what it looks like. Naruto had nowhere near the vision of the Byakugan, so he couldn't perfectly see the movement of chakra through the pathways or tenketsu, but he could see enough to spot how it flowed and the color at least. What does that mean? Naruto finally sat back, allowing his eyes to narrow like usual, which was a small relief to Shizuku. He thought for a moment in silence as his friend continued to attempt to dry off by the fire, although it didn't seem to be working much to her distress. I have no idea. Maybe it has something to do with your elemental affinity. At this point Naruto could only speculate, while in Suna he had noticed slightly more difference in people's chakra that were ninja, especially Junin. However, it had never been to the extent that Shizuku's had changed. In any case, we won't find out now, we should get some sleep. The girl smiled timidly but gave a firm nod. Right. A small smirk played over her lips for a moment as she lay down to sleep. And tomorrow you teach me how to wall walk. This is awesome. It was a few days after Shizuku had managed to unlock her chakra and they were still making their way steadily through the jungle. The only difference was that Shizuku now took every opportunity she could to walk up any tree, mushroom or really anything vertical in sight. Naruto had thought it might grow tiresome to see her continually amazed by something that was so simple to most who learned to use chakra. On the contrary, it was rather refreshing to see her take such delight in such a small and trivial thing. Then again, he guessed to a civilian who had only lived an ordinary mundane life would find such things to be extraordinary. He was surprised by her quick uptake. She got the exercise down within 2 days and was able to securely stay on the trees even while still. Although on the first attempt she had nearly put her back out trying to keep her body horizontal, forcing Naruto to teach her how to channel chakra to other parts of her body to reinforce her back and legs. Luckily, once you could send chakra to your feet, anywhere else proved to be much easier. Be careful. His only response was the echo of Shizuku's laughter as she jumped from one branch to another. He hadn't been thrilled when she began hopping from tree to tree, but she seemed fairly apt at it and he rationalized he would be there to catch her if she fell, so he allowed it. Suddenly she appeared by his side, dropping from a reasonable height but using chakra to both reinforce her legs and cushion the blow. Shizuku had been in relatively good spirits lately, things were just looking up for her. The dense foliage meant that the rain couldn't reach them, something that was a rarity for her when she was outside. Plus she now had access to her chakra, which meant she felt full of life and energy, which only enhanced her now seemingly permanent bubbly attitude. The only strange thing was that every time she seemed to use chakra in large amounts she would get wet for no discernible reason. It's fine, you don't have to worry. Her smile practically sparkled despite the lack of sunlight reaching them through the jungle canopy. I have a great teacher after all, Naruto-sensei. The blonde gave a small sigh along with his customary smile. Not you too, Shizuku. The purple-haired girl merely gave a beaming grin before running off again, under Naruto's careful watch of course. He was glad the various large and dangerous animals were staying away from the pair for some reason, but it never hurt to be a bit too cautious. As he watched her run he felt a sudden weight appear on his shakuju. Looking around he was surprised to see a small Capuchin monkey sitting there, staring at him with curious brown eyes. The blonde and the monkey just stared at one another for a few moments before the small mammal chittered excitedly. Hey, what the? Suddenly the monkey raced across his arm, his little hands and feet tickling the monk as they clambered at his body. It paused around his neck for a moment, sniffing at the magatama bead hanging from his ear before blinking in rapid succession and chittering again. He took it in his hands, nibbling it briefly before climbing down Naruto's back, once again eliciting a few laughs from the blonde. It did a full rotation around his waist before looking up, chirping like a bird and jumping off. Naruto just smiled as he watched the excitable creature run off before frowning as he noticed he was a little lighter than usual. Glancing down, his eyes widened as he realized the scroll containing all of their supplies and camping equipment was missing. He looked up shocked, just to see the monkey's tail disappear around the side of a tree. Without even thinking, he took off after it, using chakra to augment his movement. "Get back here!" Shizuku saw and heard him run off, her eyebrows raised in confusion as she too took off after him, now somewhat able to keep up with the fast pace he set. However, as fast as Naruto was, the Capuchin was far more maneuverable. It also knew the jungle better than him. The only thing that allowed Naruto to keep track of the quick little simian was his ability to see its chakra, even through the trees for a short distance. After leading then on a merry little chase where both Naruto and Shizuku were forced to dodge stray branches due to Naruto missing when he tried to use Bansho Tenon to capture the animal, the monkey finally stopped in a clearing. Naruto slowed to a stop, making very careful and deliberate movements towards the small black Capuchin who was just standing there, occasionally nibbling on the end of the scroll with its small pointy teeth. Raising an arm, Naruto smirked. There was no way it would be able to doge him this time. "Bansho. Hey Naruto." The monkey's head whipped round, already chittering excitedly before it seemingly vanished into a pile of leaves. Naruto sighed as the monkey disappeared just as Shizuku jumped into the clearing. "Why did you run off like that?" Naruto turned to her, considering telling her off, but upon seeing her curious and innocent face he just didn't have the heart. "A monkey stole the scroll with all the food and supplies." The girl blinked incredulously at the strangeness of the situation before letting out a giggle behind her hand. "Well, did you catch it?" Naruto just wearily shook his head, absently pointing to the pile of leaves the monkey had disappeared into. "It ran off before I could grab it." He conveniently left out the fact that she was the one who alerted him to their presence in the first place. Shizuku just looked at him funnily before walking over to the pile of loose leaves. "Hey cool, there's a door here." Naruto blinked before looking around. Sure enough, Shizuku was holding up one side of a trapdoor, peering down into the darkness it hid. "Maybe the monkey went in here." Naruto just shrugged. It was possible. Shizuku smiled brightly at that before descending the steps. Naruto just looked at her like she was mad. "What are you doing?" Shizuku gave the blonde the exact same look as she continued to walk down the steps carefully. "What do you mean? We need those supplies, don't we?" She said it as if she weren't walking down into a completely unknown corridor in the middle of a jungle that had no discernible reason for being there. "Now are you coming or not?" With that, her head vanished as she walked further down the stone flight of steps. Naruto stared at the spot for a moment before his eyes widened and he ran after her. "Hey, wait up." He caught up to her at the bottom of the stairs, peering into the inky darkness with difficulty while Naruto's superior eyesight had little trouble. It was just a long corridor with a few branches splitting off seemingly at random. The walls all had the same criss-crossing wooden pattern that was dizzying to try and follow, while every so often there would be a small inlet with an unlit candle adorning the wall. Naruto walked up to the first one and channeled as much fire chakra into his hand as he could. A small flame appeared over his fingertip which he quickly transferred to the candle. "Oh great, how are we supposed to find the monkey in this place? It looks like it goes on forever." Naruto just sighed at the girl. It was her idea in the first place to come down here. "Don't worry, if we get close enough I'll be able to see its chakra, even through a few walls." Satisfied now, Shizuku beamed before confidently walking into the darkness of the underground compound. Neither one noticed as they passed over an otherwise unassuming piece of floor, only for it to moments later crack open a single dull, brown eye. Chapter 14, Storm 4. The man of wisdom is never of two minds, the man of benevolence never worries, the man of courage is never afraid. Confucius. Just what is this place anyway? Shizuku was staring into the darkness beyond one of the many doorways lining the corridors as Naruto lit yet another candle with pure fire chakra. "I don't know, it looks abandoned." I read that a lot of the Third Shinobi War took place in Kusa no Kuni, maybe it's some kind of ninja base. Shizuku blinked as she tried to make anything in the smothering darkness beyond what Naruto had already lit. Wouldn't there be symbols for the village everywhere then? So far it's all just the same wooden pattern and candle brackets. Naruto frowned as he moved on to the next spot on the wall, all the while looking out for any chakra signatures in the area. For all he knew, the monkey was long gone along with the scroll, alternately it could have just completely abandoned it somewhere. While sealing scrolls, like any fuinjutsu, did let off some chakra, it wasn't enough for Naruto to see through walls. I really don't think shinobi would go about emblazoning their symbols everywhere, especially during a war. Shizuku looked around in confusion as she abandoned the room, not being able to glean anything from the oppressive darkness. Don't they wear those forehead protector thingies with their village's symbol on them? Naruto nodded absently as he looked into a room. Seeing nothing but banks of old-looking computers and a few desks, he quickly came back out. Why did they do that anyway? I mean, aren't they supposed to be sneaky? Isn't having the village you're from printed on your forehead kind of counterproductive? Naruto sighed as the two moved on. He knew Shizuku was only making conversation because there wasn't much else she could actually do down here in the dark. I believe it's a matter of pride in your village, the place you grew up and want to protect. Shizuku nodded slowly as they walked, their feet clapping against the earthen slabs beneath them to echo down the hallways. But couldn't somebody just steal another village's forehead protector and frame them for something? Naruto gave a small smile as he lit yet another of the seemingly hundreds of candles in the base. I'm sure somebody has thought of that and actually tried it in the past. And I'm just as sure somebody has found ways of preventing it from happening again. Remember, if one village can do it, then they all can. Again Shizuku nodded slowly, her lip pouting out slightly in a rather cute manner. Yeah, you don't have to spell it out like I'm dumb. Naruto just chuckled as they walked on, his eyes scanning the area methodically for any sign of, well, anything. He smirked as he put on his best sagely voice and raised his head in an over-exaggerated display of haughtiness. A thing is never too often repeated which is never sufficiently learned, my young student. He only heard Shizuku mumble something under her breath as she crossed her arms under her chest and pouted again. And that's another thing, you should stop with all the wise proverb stuff. It's really, Naruto's eyes suddenly shot open in surprise as he leapt at the girl, tackling her around the waist to the ground just as a large slab of the floor flipped over. If he hadn't moved any sooner, Shizuku would have most likely been crushed beneath the weighty stone block. The Violette just stared at the spot with wide eyes, her breath coming out on short shallow gasps as Naruto quickly got to his feet again. Where are you? Come out. The blonde was worried, he had only sensed the attack moments before it happened by the minute amount of chakra leaking into the earth. Now though there was nothing at all to even indicate the attack had happened, the hallways were quiet and Naruto couldn't even see a whisper of chakra besides himself and Shizuku. Shizuku, stay close to me. The blonde whirled around when he met no response, only to come face to face with a wall of solid earth. Shizuku. The blonde placed his hand up against the wall, quickly drawing the chakra out of it before smashing his fist right through it, breaking down the now brittle earth. Unfortunately, all he saw beyond it was darkness. Shizuku was gone and Naruto couldn't even see her chakra signature. Shizuku. All he got was his own voice repeatedly echoing off of the wooden walls around him, mocking him with their shared plea. A growl rose in the blonde's throat as he slammed his shakuju down on the ground once, the sharp noise carrying all the way through the quiet base. I will raise this base to get her back if I have to. Do you hear me? Again only his own voice greeted his ears as the anger-filled call reverberated around him. Oh my, is the bite-sized monk angry perhaps? Naruto whirled at the voice that sounded like it was whispering right into his ear. Only a darkened corridor greeted him. Where are you? A dark but almost playful chuckling echoed from what appeared to be all around the blonde, like the very walls were speaking to him. Oh, but isn't that part of the fun in this little game of hide and seek? Don't you know? You trespassed on Orochimaru-sama's property and now you're paying the price. Naruto quickly composed himself with a deep breath, focusing on his chakra and not the voice that seemed to love to mock him. Oh, ignoring me. My, that just won't do. There was a pause as Naruto continued to scan the area for any sign of the mystery speaker. Perhaps you would be a little more inclined to indulge me if you knew what the prize of the game was. Naruto could now tell that whoever this was took almost sadistic glee in what they were doing. Find me if you can, little monk. I don't believe your young friend here has all that long. The voice began to fade away as it spoke, the last few words sounding like a whisper that was far too close for Naruto's comfort. Naruto slammed his staff through the corner of a wall in frustration, finding satisfaction in the chunks of mortar and splinters of wood now littering the ground. He quickly took another calming breath to stop his trembling fist before quickly forming 5 shadow clones, his current limit. However, as soon they began to run off into various corridors to cover more grounds, large pillars of earth grew at astonishing rates beneath them. 3 of them were instantly dispelled into clouds of smoke from being crushed, whilst another was pinned by its arm to the ceiling. Naruto cursed, dispelling the remaining 2 as he took off at a run. When his vision was split multiple ways, he lost some of his ability to see chakra, so it was harder to predict the attacks. As much help as the clones would be in covering more ground, they were useless if they couldn't get more than a couple of feet. What a naughty little monk, cheating is strictly prohibited. Naruto had to visibly restrain himself from shouting back at the mysterious voice, but he refused to give it the satisfaction. That same irritating musical voice just laughed at him as he sprinted down yet another corridor, sounding neither male nor female. The dark was no issue, his eyes granted him good enough vision to at least see where he was going. Tick tock, your friend's head's on the chopping block. Again the voice cackled madly while Naruto did his best to ignore it, frantically searching for any chakra signature he could find. Finally he found success as he rounded a corner to see Shizuku tied up, bound by her wrists and ankles, just lying in the middle of the corridor. However, as he approached her he slowed, Shikuju raised defensively in front of him as his eyes narrowed. Shizuku. The girl blinked her eyes open tiredly before they landed on Naruto. Suddenly she was alert as she struggled against her bonds, shouting muffled words against the gag in her mouth. Naruto jogged over, staff still raised in a defensive manner as he quickly unbound the girl. She got to her feet wearily, rubbing her sore wrists before suddenly pouncing on Naruto, wrapping him up in a warm hug. I knew you would come, Naruto. Suddenly though the girl froze, her eyes going wide with shock as she jerkily turned her head to see Naruto with his outstretched fingers just finishing applying precise pressure point attacks down her spine. And Naruto. The blonde's hair was shadowing his eyes as he stepped back from the now paralyzed girl, Shikuju raised out in front of him. Where is Shizuku? The girl just stared at Naruto with wide, tearing eyes, unable to move her body. And Naruto, what's going on? The monk's head sunk even lower as his hands clenched into fists. Seeing Shizuku that way hurt him. He strode forward, pressing his hand up against her stomach as his eyes narrowed. I will drain you dry of chakra if you don't tell me where she is. All of a sudden the frightened, timid look of the Violette's face vanished, replaced by a cruel smirk, far too wide for her own face. Her neck swiveled awkwardly at angles that weren't physically possible just to face the blonde as her usual teal eyes faded into a dirty brown. How very fascinating. Before Naruto's very eyes the girl before him lost all natural color, her entire form taking on an earthy brown hue before crumbling away into dirt. My duplicates are exact copies, there isn't a single flaw or strand of hair different. How did you notice the difference? Naruto pivoted on his foot to face where he thought the voice was coming from, only to see a grotesque sight. The ground of the corridor in front of him bulged outwards, rising up into a loose, curvy pillar of mud that began to drip large chunks of mud onto the ground where it was absorbed back into the floor. Slowly as more of the dirt fell away a form was revealed, that of a tall, lithe man wearing a disheveled brown tunic and trousers with more dirt than fabric. However, most horrifically his legs seemed fused together, still attached to the floor as if he was simply a stray root from some plant. His skin was surprisingly pale from what Naruto could see beneath his dirty mop of dark hair that fell about his face, covering one eye and falling most of the way down his back. The one visible eye was the same dull brown that the clone had just before fading away into dust, gleaming with interest and a sickening glee. This was only strengthened by the abnormally large grin that almost threatened to split the man's face in two. My, aren't you just an interesting little monk? I wonder what else you can do. Naruto's eyes simply narrowed dangerously as he planted his staff in the ground firmly, taking a loose starting stance for the Kaminari no Mai. I'll show you, Bansho Tenin. The entirety of the man's upper body suddenly lurched forward as if pulled by some invisible rope, however he stayed firmly rooted to the floor. Naruto still used the opportunity to cover the distance between them, lashing out with a solid finger strike to a nerve bundle that should have paralyzed the man long enough for Naruto to complete the maneuver. However, to Naruto's surprise, where his fingers impacted the man, his body just crumbled away like loosely packed dirt. Oh, now that tickled. Without warning, the man's body suddenly extended grotesquely until he better resembled a snake, quickly wrapping Naruto up like a boa constrictor. With his prey bound, the man lowered his torso until the two were at eye level. Yes, I feel there are many fascinating things to discover about you once we get you onto the operating table. Naruto just grimaced as the pressure on his body increased as he was wrapped up tighter. And not going to happen, Shinra Tensei. He struggled for a moment before his eyes shot open, one of the rings that circled his pupils contracting for a split second. Like a wall, an invisible burst of energy quickly expanded from the boy's body, strong enough to completely blast the man's snake-like lower body into chunks of useless earth. He lay there for a moment just staring at Naruto with those same lifeless eyes that continued to sparkle with intrigue. Oh yes, I will have to bring you to Orochimaru-sama himself. He will want to take a good, long look at you, Naruto. As he spoke, Naruto watched as his body seemed to melt away into mud, quickly fusing with the floor until there was just a pair of bloodshot brown eyes staring at him out of the earth, then they too vanished. The blonde quickly picked up his shakuju, leaning on it for support as he gasped for breath. Being slowly squeezed until you could feel your bones begin to creak was not pleasant. He tried to figure out what had just happened. When the man moved into the floor, his chakra vanished completely, like he was literally nothing but actual mud. However, while he was choking him, it was all too visible. Naruto didn't know how anybody could just vanish like that. It was weird, but he could have sworn the man's chakra was brown. That in itself was incredibly strange. He tried to rationalize that it must have simply been a clone of some sort, but the more he thought about it, the more he was sure that was the real man in the flesh, or mud. The worst thing was that Naruto realized why it seemed so familiar. The man's chakra was different in the same way Shizuku's was. However, instead of his chakra flowing like water through a stream, it seemed sluggish like liquid mud, trickling down a hill. In some places when he had been merging with the floor, Naruto had seen his chakra stop moving altogether. Naruto filed that information away for later. He was sure it would somehow be important. For now he still had to focus on getting Shizuku back. He continued to run through the halls, noting that the voice seemed conspicuously absent, as well as the fact that there seemed to be fewer choices about where he could go. Fairly soon, before he could get frustrated enough to start blasting through some walls, he found himself in a large open room that was already lit. The light hurt his eyes for a few moments after running through the dark tunnels for so long, and he was forced to cover them with his arm. When he lowered it, his eyes widened in surprise. The room was full of Shizuku copies, all of them fake if their chakra signatures were anything to go on. Disturbingly, they all felt like extensions of that one man more than normal clones, which put the blonde on edge. As if he could be summoned with a thought, the man appeared on the ceiling, melting out of the roof to hang there limply, again resembling a root. Before he could do much though, all of the Shizuku copies turned to look at him, their teal eyes watering. Oh dear, so many little girls to pick from, and yet all of them are fake, how sad. As he spoke, the man's body stretched down from the ceiling, his torso coming up to face the blonde with a sickening grin. Or are they? Naruto clenched a fist as he raised his other hand, ready to blast all of the clones away if he had to. I don't have time for your games, tell me where the real Shizuku is. Quickly the man out up a hand, a playful smirk on his twisted features. I wouldn't go launching one of those fancy gravity blasts, Naruto-kun. You see, little Shizuku is somewhere in the room. You wouldn't want to hurt her now, would you? Didn't you make a promise that she would never cry again? Naruto suddenly froze as he stared at the limp man, who simply grinned back like he was meeting an old friend after many years. How do you know that? And how do you know my name? The man let out a quiet chuckle that became increasingly sinister as it went on, suddenly dropping to the floor as his body splashed out like a drop of mud on the floor. As it congealed back together into his body, his head swiveled on his neck to stare with piercing eyes at the monk. Oh, but I know you, Naruto-kun, I know all about you. Your Rinnegan, little Shizuku, even the special guests in your stomach. The blonde took an involuntary step back as the man finally reformed, his legs still fused in that disturbing way. You see, Orochimaru-sama saw fit to grant me a tremendous power in return for keeping this little out-of-the-way base safe for him. He allowed me to become one with the earth, giving me an unkillable body of mud and dirt. Not only that, but I am able to reach deep into your mind with only a single touch, just one brush and all your little secrets come tumbling out. He smiled again, his body growing slightly as he was raised higher into the air. I am Madara, guardian of the Northwest Research Facility. Now, how should we proceed with our little game? By this point Naruto's eyes were shadowed by his hair, his hands clenched into fists that trembled ever so slightly. I said, give me back my friend. There was no prior indication, no subtle hints, no warning whatsoever. One moment they were in a brightly lit room full of Shizuku clones, the next everything just exploded. When the dust finally cleared, it revealed a large layer of sand covering everything, most of the duplicates themselves having been broken down into sand grains. Madara himself was tightly bound in a cocoon of the fine golden grains, only his head sticking out. You think a trap made of earth can hold me? Have you listened to nothing I've? The mud man suddenly paused, his eyes widening in panic as his struggle became more apparent. What are you doing? Naruto allowed the briefest of smirks to cross his features as he brought a second hand up, focusing all his control on the sand binding the slippery man. You know my abilities, so take a guess. The man growled in irritation, his face distorting grotesquely as he attempted to change his body and escape the sand prison. Your Preta path, but how? Naruto chuckled slightly as the sand began to constrict around Madara's body. You obviously didn't look all that hard into my memories then. The Preta path works against anything my chakra makes contact with, and this sand is saturated in it. His expression became darker as his glowing Rinnegan eyes pierced through Madara like he wasn't even there. Now tell me where Shizuku is. Even if your body is immune to regular attacks, I bet it won't work if you're drained of chakra. As if to punctuate the point, the mud man began to feel dizzy from the quick rate he was losing his energy. Go to hell, brat. The man tried to spit in Naruto's direction as the blonde walked closer, but the sand constricted even further, making him gasp loudly. The man's mouth twitched up in a sickening facsimile of a grin as he looked directly at Naruto. Go ahead, crush me. See if you get your little girl back ever again. Naruto just maintained his smile, which had once again settled into his usual serene look. I've already said I would raise this base to the ground before I allow her to be hurt. You've seen my memories, am I lying? The struggling man only growled again before laughing darkly between strained breaths. Anyway, he jingled his shakuju casually, causing the man to suddenly look at the simple staff with fear. I don't need to crush you when I have this right. Madara only narrowed his eyes as Naruto raised the shakuju until the end of the staff was just in front of the mud man's forehead. Last chance, Madara of the Northwest Base, tell me where Shizuku is. Naruto's only reply was another failed attempt to spit at him before his eyes narrowed and he tapped the end of the staff against the insubstantial man's head. There was the distinct sound of a gong ringing around the room for a moment, and when it passed, Madara had tensed up, his eyes glazing over slightly. Hey, you think this is the end, brat? Orochimaru-sama will find you eventually, nobody can ever defeat him. Eventually you'll be laid down on a cold metal table and he'll poke and prod at those eyes of yours until nothing remains. As the man spoke, his skin began to turn ashen, his hair falling away in clumps of mud as his body began to destabilize without the necessary chakra to hold it together. Just you wait and see, Jinchuriki, you'll die someday soon. Naruto narrowed his eyes as the last of the man finally melted away into a small brown puddle of the floor. His gaze was torn away as he suddenly heard a deep gasp for air and a choking cough. He looked around only to be surprised as Shizuku was held up by his sand in the exact position Madara had been in moments ago. With a thought that made his slightly queasy, Naruto realized Madara had been holding Shizuku inside of his body this whole time, and that was why he couldn't sense her or see her chakra. He allowed the sand to fall away, catching her as she fell to the ground limply, still drawing in large breaths of fresh air. Shizuku, are you okay? The purple-haired girl offered him a weak smile, her eyes lidded as her head bobbed exhaustedly in his arms. He got mud all over my Miko outfit. Her voice was rather weak and croaky, but it still managed to get a small laugh out of Naruto. Come on, let's go. He gently picked her up, pulling her soundly onto his back where she gratefully wrapped her arms around his neck to hold on. As they walked, her head would loll from side to side and her eyes began to droop, but to her credit she stayed awake. "What did you do to him?" Her voice was quiet, very different to how she usually acted. Naruto thought it was kind of cute. He just looked down thoughtfully as they made their way back through the winding passages of the base. "My Shikuju has the ability to permanently take away somebody's ability to use chakra. Without it his body couldn't hold itself together, so he fell apart." Shizuku nodded tiredly as they walked closer to the exit, snuggling her face into his neck slightly to get more comfortable, eliciting a small blush from the monk. "Is he dead?" The girl felt he blonde tense at her words, his steps pausing for a moment, the bright light of the outside just a few steps away. "No." And with that Naruto walked on, vanishing from the base as his form was silhouetted by the bright light from outside. "Oh hey, it's the monkey." Naruto's eye was twitching rather violently as he stared at the small Capuchin monkey, who simply stared right back, chittering occasionally and nibbling at the scroll it was still carrying. Shizuku just sleepily waved at the small animal. It cocked its head slightly before parroting the action back to her, making the sleepy girl chuckle. "He's cute, can we keep him?" Naruto was still partially frozen, his eye now in excessive spasm as his mind rebooted from the crash it had undergone. He wasn't even in the base. Naruto's face was now a rather virulent shade of red as he trembled in mixture of exhaustion and frustration. However, Shizuku quietly giggling into his ear calmed him down somewhat and he settled for slumping down onto the ground. Shizuku finally took the opportunity to slip off his back, lying down on the soft ground and letting her eyes finally close to get some much-needed sleep. The monkey scampered over to the pair, occasionally turning his head this way and that as he took in the young blonde monk and his sleeping companion. He held out the scroll in his small hands, shrieking a few times before dropping it and scurrying up Naruto's staff to perch there, ignoring the blonde for now as he began to pick insects out of his fur. Naruto just blinked at the strange sight before falling over on his back, leaving the staff upright in the ground to not disturb the little Capuchin. "You know you really caused us a lot of trouble, little guy." The monkey looked his way for just a moment, observed him and quickly went back to what it was doing. Naruto gave a dry chuckle as he raised his hand, once again bringing the sand up to form a makeshift hut. He noticed his arms burned slightly from the large influx of the Shukaku's chakra he had used inside the base, but he figured a night's rest would fix that, it usually did for everything else. As his eyes began to close, he cast a glance over to where Shizuku was curling up around herself, pulling her thin clothes closer to her body. With a wary sigh, the blonde picked himself up and walked over, carefully draping his heavy cloak over her shivering form. Days in the jungle could be very warm and humid, but at night it could get very cold. He smiled tiredly as the girl instinctively pulled the cloak around herself before a frown manifested on his brow. "I nearly lost her today. I wasn't strong enough to protect her at the start. I need to start taking my job as her teacher seriously. Starting tomorrow I'll teach her things that will actually protect her when I can't." With a sleepy nod of satisfaction, the blonde retreated back a little, having the good sense to grab a sleeping mat before crashing down on it, falling asleep almost as soon as his head hit the ground. "My elemental affinity." Naruto nodded as he walked. They were once again making their eyes steadily through Kusa no Kuni, now in an eastern direction on their way to Kaminari no Kuni. "Yeah, now that you have access to your chakra and have begun control exercises, we should get your affinity as soon as possible." Shizuku's eyes lit up. She had really recovered well from the whole underground base incident and was back to her old cheery self by the morning. Then again, that may or may not have been due to the new traveling companion they had picked up. The little Capuchin was currently riding along on Naruto's Shikuju, occasionally playing with the rings at the end of the staff to make them jangle more. Shizuka had affectionately named him Masaru, although Naruto had no idea why. "Oh cool, then can you teach me awesome jutsu like breathing fire or firing bolts of lightning?" Shizuku was looking at him with stars in her eyes, which made the blonde slightly nervous. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly as he looked away, suddenly finding the grain of his staff's wood very interesting. "Actually, the only jutsu I know is the shadow clone jutsu. Everything else is either due to my Rinnegan or my new sand abilities." Her shoulders slumped at that, with Naruto once again noting the sound of the rain increasing for just a moment. It might have been his imagination though. "But I'm sure we can pick up some jutsu scrolls once we find your affinity." As if a switch had been flipped, bubbly, Shizuku was back, looking at Naruto with fresh determination and glee. Alright, so how do we find my affinity? Naruto smiled confidently as he strode on, noticing that the trees were beginning to thin out slightly and more of the rain getting through the canopy, which was a good sign. We need some paper, chakra paper. You channel some into it and it reacts differently depending on your affinity. Most people only have one, others with bloodline limits can have 2 or 3, and then when most shinobi become Junin they develop a second. Except you can only see your second affinity on chakra paper once you master your first, otherwise the first overpowers the second. You have to train to be able to hold back that specific elemental chakra. Shizuku nodded excitedly, happy to be finally learning something again, even though the ability to walk up walls was still incredibly cool. Alright, then, where do we get chakra paper? At that Naruto smirked even as he pulled up his cloak's hood to protect against the rain, which was now becoming even more apparent. Well, there are 3 places in the elemental nations that produce it: Kanahagakure no Sato, a few islands in Mizu no Kuni, and Takigakure no Sato in Tani no Kuni. Luckily, Takigakure is on our way to Kaminari no Kuni. Shizuku's eyes widened in happiness that they were already so close. Of course it didn't last long as she too pulled up the hood of her cloak to ward off the rain. Unfortunately, however, I have no idea where Takigakure is. Shizuku nearly tripped and fell over at that. Righting herself with a slight flush, she looked at Naruto strangely. The blonde merely sighed. They're supposed to be really secretive. Even merchants are blindfolded and led through some caves before they're allowed in the village. Chiriku-senpai had been there once. Apparently they get the paper from this enormous tree in the center of the village. Shizuku blinked in confusion, also to get water out of her eye as a rain droplet fell down her face, but mostly in confusion. Well, if merchants get there it can't be too hard to find. Naruto just sighed and rubbed the back of his head. He almost used his shikuju to do it but remembered Masaru at the last moment. I wouldn't be too certain. The village prides itself on never having been invaded, not even once. As if some divine being chose that moment to stress Naruto's point, the treeline finally broke. The 2 preteens found themselves looking over a large cliff with an incredible vista-like view stretching out in front of them. As far as the eye could see, various valleys that seemed completely subsumed by forest spanned the landscape. Rivers flowed throughout the whole scene with various waterfalls dotted around from the numerous cliff faces. Shizuku blinked in amazement at the beautiful yet daunting scene. Wow, I can suddenly see why. Naruto on the other hand just groaned, having to lean on his staff for support all of a sudden. I still can't see any roads. Chapter 13, Storm Part 5. I have not failed, I have just found 1,000 ways that do not work. Thomas Edison. Luckily for the 2 of them, they actually managed to stumble across a road after finding a winding path to take them down the cliff face. It wasn't very wide or well maintained, but it was a definite step up from trekking through seemingly uncharted jungle aimlessly. The trio of boy, girl, and monkey steadily made their way along the road, noticing it begin to widen as well as a few signs of better upkeep. They quickly found out why when it suddenly merged with a much better maintained road that was actually paved. After that, it wasn't long before they reached a small town. Shizuku was grateful for the opportunity to change her clothes and get them cleaned while Naruto stocked up on their supplies. Currently they were sitting in a small outdoor cafe, a plate of steaming dango between them which Shizuku was happily munching her way through. They were getting some odd looks from the town's residents. Naruto guessed it wasn't every day you saw such a young monk and Miko eating casually while occasionally feeding a small Capuchin monkey. However, as they ate, Naruto was casting a well-hidden eye around them, not entirely sure what he was looking for himself until he spotted them. A small trio walking along the road, rather unremarkable save for the headbands they all wore. The simple metal plate was engraved with what appeared to be 2 mirrored lightning bolts that the blonde knew to be the symbol of the hidden waterfall village. Naruto smiled at that. It was good to see there was a shinobi presence here. It meant they couldn't be too far off from the village itself. Usually hidden villages made good shows of protecting the various towns and settlements within their respective countries. However, most of the time it was merely for appearance's sake. Ninja rarely did anything for free, especially if it spread out their available manpower. If there was an actual patrol in the village and not just some shinobi on their way to, or back from, a mission, then it was a good guess to say Takigakure no Sato was close. Unfortunately, Naruto knew he couldn't just follow them back to their village. As soon as they left the town they would take off at speed, and if the two of them were caught running like that it would be highly suspicious. Naruto had tried asking around town for the way into Taki, but the residents had been very tight-lipped. Apparently even merchants had to go through a special process before being allowed to enter the village. With a sigh, the blonde quickly paid for their food and motioned for his companion to follow him. He couldn't follow the ninja, but nothing was stopping him from traveling in the general direction they were going. Originally Naruto had planned on using his Rinnegan to seek out the area of high chakra density a hidden village would surely be, but he then remembered shinobi villages had defenses against that kind of thing. It was started by Konoha during the founding of their village. The wife of the Shodai Hokage had constructed an enormous barrier array that would not only hide the village, giving more credit to its name, but also alert a special team of any and all entries into the village. However, it obviously couldn't account for people leaving the barrier if Naruto was able to leave with the ease he did. Other villages had similar countermeasures, mostly against the threat of the Byakugan and Sharingan, which could both see chakra. At first Naruto had been rather excited when he found the name Mito Uzumaki, going on to discover lots about the Uzumaki clan from the extensive library in the temple. The old Hokage had always told him he was an orphan and didn't know who his parents were. He had always taken that to mean his given name was just chosen at random. However, it had still been fun for the young monk in training to imagine for just a moment he actually had a clan, a rather powerful one at that if the history books were anything to go on. Unfortunately, the Uzumaki, along with their home village Uzushiogakure no Sato, had long been wiped from the elemental nations. On top of that, Naruto had none of the recognizable characteristics of the clan famed for their longevity. He had neither the traditional red hair nor common purple eyes. He didn't count the fact his Rinnegan was purple as much as he would like to. Still, the blonde briefly enjoyed the fleeting fantasy of having a family, even if they were spread to the four winds of the continent. Back in the present, Naruto had moved on to Plan B, which involved a lot of aimless wandering until they happened to come across a clue to Taki's general whereabouts. With that in mind, the duo, or trio if you counted Masaru, left the town in the same direction as the Taki shinobi. Being the country that it was, it didn't take long for Naruto to come across a nice large clearing at the base of an even larger waterfall that provided a nice background roar. "Why'd we stop here? I thought we were looking for Taki." Naruto just gave Shizuku a fond grin as he shrugged off his traveling cloak, a thin pole-like protrusion of sand rising from the earth to catch it. While traveling out of Kusa and into Taki, Naruto had worked relentlessly on his manipulation over the element. He was still nowhere near the mastery Gaara had held, but he was definitely closing the gap with his determination and stamina. He pointed over to the raging waterfall behind him as he also began to remove the top portion of his robes, making Shizuku blush for reasons she couldn't quite fathom. That's why we're here at a waterfall. For being only 11, Naruto had a well-trained physique thanks to the rigorous and scheduled training undergone at the temple. His muscles were lean and developed but not overly bulked to the point where they would hinder movement. Monks trained their entire lives so they could run through their training kata flawlessly, able to hold certain awkward positions for hours at a time in deep concentration. "You're kidding me. You just expect to search every waterfall in Tani no Kuni and just hope to stumble onto a hidden village?" Naruto just gave a large grin and a small nod as he rolled his shoulders, loosening them as he created more sand construct to hold his top and pouches. "That too, but I also want to move on to the next level of wind manipulation training." Shizuku widened her eyes in understanding. Occasionally she would see Naruto split leaves with his chakra, and after she had asked he had explain all about the various elements and their individual chakra types. She gulped as she looked up at the enormous waterfall relentlessly pounding down on the small pool next to them. She wasn't sure what she had expected when Naruto had told her about this stage in wind training, but perhaps something smaller. "You're going to cut that?" Naruto nodded excitedly. Honestly, he had been waiting for an opportunity like this since leaving Suna, and he was raring to go. He had gotten to the point where he could split leaves almost absently, even using different parts of his body. It no longer provided any meaningful challenge to him. The same could be said for the initial stage of fire manipulation, although Naruto could learn that at his leisure, so there was less rush. "That's the plan anyway. We'll move from waterfall to waterfall each day, do our usual exercise and look for a way into Taki. With that he smiled and reached into one of the pouches he had placed on the new sand table he had made. After rummaging for a moment he removed a small scroll with a few intricate designs around the edges. On the middle it was printed with a very ornate and archaic kanji for elements. In all, the scroll looked rather old and precious. Shizuku nearly fumbled it when Naruto casually threw it over to her. This is one of the scrolls my senpai gave me before I left the temple. It contains all of the introductory stages to elemental manipulation. You should get as much practice as you can in, so I figured you could start training in your element a bit early. Shizuku just looked at him and the scroll in confusion as the blonde made his way over to the waterfall. But don't we need to figure out my affinity first? Naruto looked back over his shoulder with a serene smile that made Shizuku a little hot despite her thin clothing. Well, technically an affinity only points to the element you would have the most ease in learning. You can technically learn any of them, although the one that opposes your affinity will generally be far too difficult to master. Try out water manipulation first. I'd take an educated guess that is your affinity anyway. The chakra paper would just be to confirm it, or see if you have a bloodline. Shizuku nodded in understanding as she unraveled the scroll, surprised by the level of detail it went into regarding each individual element. By the time she had found the section on water-natured chakra, Naruto had already created a small platform for himself out of compacted sand just in front of the waterfall. In twin puffs of smoke, two identical copies of the blonde appeared and took their places next to him as the original tested out the waters with a hand. The power of the falling water was remarkable. He had heard monks meditated underneath waterfalls on occasion, but after feeling how strong the flow of water was, it seemed a little daunting. Even so, he plunged his hands into the cold waters and began to channel as much wind chakra as he could. While Naruto began the next step of his own training, Shizuku could only watch on in amazement as the tiniest cut in the flow of the impressive waterfall appeared on either side of his outstretched hands. She moved further away, towards the more calm waters further down the large stream. Her scroll recommended a still pond to begin with, but the girl reasoned she had to work with what she had. Rereading the scroll just to be sure, the Violette nodded her head determinedly as she placed her hand flat across the water. The point of the exercise was to pull your hand away from the water, bringing a small pillar of the liquid with it. The higher you could raise your hand without breaking the pillar, the better your control over the element was. Shizuku took a calming breath as she remembered all of the instruction she had received from Naruto about chakra. She quickly found that small flame at her core, manipulating it, guiding the chakra into her hand where she held it. Gently she began to expel the chakra, imagining it liquid and flowing like the scroll instructed. Ever so slowly she pulled her hand away from the stream, her eyes widening in amazement as a small strand of water connected with her palm and rose with it. However, with her excitement came a drop in her concentration, causing the small strand of water to flop lifelessly back into the stream. She looked over to Naruto to tell him of her initial success, only to see the blonde with an intense look of concentration she didn't see from him often. His eyes were open and steeled as he focused his will into halting the flow of the mighty waterfall. Spurred on by this, the purple-haired girl quickly returned to her own task, her determination and resolve renewed as she once again lay her hand flat against the clear water. Over the next week the two youths improved steadily with their respective techniques, Shizuku slightly faster at her own due to it being less complex. Naruto was also having difficulty with how the waterfalls they stopped at each day varied in width. He could already cut the entire waterfall's flow, but not by himself. He had cut it down to only a single shadow clone, but he wanted to master the exercise on his own, so he continued on. Shizuku was surprisingly having more ease with her own training. In the first day she had worked on spreading out her chakra flow to her entire hand in order to get a thicker pillar. After that it was fairly simple to just keep extending the small water pillar while maintaining her focus. She knew the ultimate goal of the exercise was to get it up to at least her waist while maintaining it with as much ease as possible. This was tested by the fact she would have to stand up halfway through raising it. One day she had even tried attempting to speed up the rate at which she could draw the chakra-laced water up with some moderate success. Right now she could just about raise her little pillar of water to her mid-thigh, meaning she was almost there. Naruto had congratulated her on her incredible progress the few times he had come over to supervise. Even with his almost inexhaustible reserves, training so much in wind chakra was tiring for the blonde. Right now the two were relaxing in front of the 10th waterfall on their little tour through the country, leaning up against the enormous cliff it fell from. They had only just arrived but the sun was beginning to set, so they had decided to forego training for the day to recuperate. They were currently just chatting absently, about little things like Naruto's time in the temple and Shizuku's time in her village. It actually surprised Naruto how much mischief the girl had managed to get up to in her time. It turned out she hadn't really appreciated being shunned and scorned for something she couldn't control, an experience Naruto could relate with. She had taken out her frustrations with various pranks on the villagers, something that hadn't really improved her situation but brought her a much-needed sense of satisfaction. Of course she got caught more than Naruto did when he did pranks, and while funny, they were nowhere near as elaborate. Even so, Naruto found himself laughing with her as she regaled one of the many humorous incidents, trading them for Naruto's own experiences. And so by the time she realized it wasn't her, cat eye had already managed to paint the front of the house bright orange. The two of them burst out laughing as they reclined against the craggy stone cliff, Shizuku leaning slightly on Naruto as she sighed out in contentment. "This is really nice, Naruto. I wish you could have come to my village sooner to get me away from there." She sighed again softly as she rested her head on the blonde's shoulder. Naruto wasn't sure what to make of the gesture but returned her smile. "I guess you're like the knight that saves the princess from the tower, except you're a monk and I'm hardly a princess." Naruto chuckled at that, earning a little of Shizuku's ire as she looked up at him with a frown. "What?" Naruto just absently waved, turning his gaze up to the sky, tracing a few of the stars in his head. "I never understood the whole princess or prince deal. I don't get why just because you're born to a daimyo you are royalty. What makes you better than other people? It's like in my old village, the clans there like the Hyuga and the Uchiha were practically considered royalty, but what exactly made them special? I mean, just because they have weird eyes doesn't make them better than others." Shizuku sighed softly as she returned her head to her little perch on the blonde's shoulder. "I guess you can talk, huh? It's just the way things are, I guess. Royalty is royalty and everybody else is just everybody else." Naruto smirked as he stared up at the moon, its crescent shape hanging over the two of them just like everybody else on the continent, an excellent equalizer. "Nah, I've never really cared for all that fate and rights by birth stuff. I mean, you can make it rain anywhere you go, what princess can say that?" Shizuku giggled as her face flushed a pale shade of red for a moment. She quite liked the idea of Naruto comparing her to a princess for some reason. The blonde suddenly got to his feet, turning around and adopting a regal posture, his face turning up slightly into a mock sneer as he offered a hand down to the girl. "If you would my aim hime." Shizuku just giggled again before coughing into her hand and looking away with faked apathy. "But it wouldn't be proper, monk-san, don't you agree?" Naruto's facade broke quickly as a grin spread across his face, quickly mirrored by his companion. However, the mood was quickly ruined by Masaru jumping atop Naruto's head, clinging onto a few blonde strands. As he chittered excitedly, Shizuku stood up on her own, giggling at Naruto and the Capuchin with her mouth covered by her sleeve. "I think Masaru wants to join in." As if agreeing with her, the little monkey stood up, still perched on Naruto's head, and copied his regal posture for a moment, making Shizuku burst out with laughter. However, Naruto suddenly quietened as his gaze drifted to a copse of trees a good distance away. As if that was the trigger, a group of shinobi suddenly appeared from the area, landing on the ground in the recognizable blur of movement that was a shunshin. With some surprise, Naruto noted that the entire squad, 6 of them, were all women, all with their head veiled by hoods and cloths that covered the lower halves of their faces. "Identify yourselves, you are dangerously close to Tokigakure without authorization." Naruto frowned when they didn't quite specify exactly how far they were from the village. Deciding to just lay along and see if the shinobi would be willing to guide them, Naruto held his hand up slightly in a show of surrender. "I'm just a traveling monk on his journey with my companion here." He smiled sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head, noticing a few of the shinobi's hands twitch toward their kunai pouches as he did so. "I was actually looking for Taki with my friend, would you be willing to take us there?" The lead kunoichi blinked in surprise at the audacity of the monk as she turned to her squad mates. They spoke in hushed voices for a while that even with his chakra-enhanced hearing Naruto couldn't quite make out. Finally they turned back, the same woman speaking again. She had shiny black hair and light green eyes from what Naruto could see. If you want access into Takigakure no Sato, you are required to be blindfolded and have a disorienting genjutsu placed over you. Do you know what that is? Naruto nodded in confirmation, as did Shizuku behind him. Naruto had gone through most of the major shinobi disciplines with her, as they were the main uses for chakra in the world. Shizuku had been interested in the idea of genjutsu, but she didn't think it was nearly as cool as normal ninjutsu sounded. Very well, we were on our way back from patrol anyway. The woman made a hand motion and two of the squad came forward, producing strips of cloth which they quickly bound around the two teenagers' eyes. Another began to run through hand seals for the genjutsu, which would rob the two of their sense of direction and muffle their hearing. Unfortunately for them, Naruto's Preta path immediately absorbed the foreign chakra in his system on reflex, rendering the jutsu useless. Not that the Taki nin knew that. And he sure wasn't going to tell them and make himself even more of a threat in their eyes. After being somewhat frog-marched through the jungle with Shizuku stumbling every few steps due to the genjutsu, Naruto felt the ground change to a more rocky surface. Naruto could tell they were standing close to another waterfall, not the one they had been by before, and were halted for a moment. Naruto desperately wanted to peek through the blindfold as he heard the sounds of the water diminish slightly, wanting to know exactly what was going on. All he could see right now were the vague outline of the kunoichi by their chakra, all varying shades of light blue. He had spent a lot of time pondering the varying shades of people's chakra. Initially he had believed it was just due to everybody's chakra just being different. However, with the number of people in the elemental nations and only limited shades of blue, that seemed unlikely. From what he knew, everybody in the world was supposed to have a different chakra signature, with twins having the most similar almost to the point of being the same. That alone also meant it wasn't dependent on DNA but something else. From Naruto's perspective, if the color of chakra wasn't part of the signature itself, it must represent something different. He looked around for a moment, his eyes quickly landing on the lead kunoichi who had spoken. Her chakra was the darkest of the group, with the shinobi leading him and Shizuku through the tunnels they had just entered being the next darkest. Perhaps it had something to do with age. Or maybe it was their chakra capacity. Naruto sighed slightly in frustration, the Taki kunoichi mistaking it for frustration at his supposed lack of direction. In fact, Naruto was memorizing each turn they took through the apparent maze of tunnels they were traversing. For all Naruto knew, the color of a person's chakra could mean any number of things. It could be to do with their affinity, their outlook on life, their diet, anything. Then of course there were people like Shizuku and Madara who completely threw any conceptions he might have out the window. His own companion had a different chakra than any other he had seen yet, and Madara's wasn't even blue. Naruto was slightly frustrated he couldn't see his own chakra. Even when he looked at his body, he guessed it was to stop him just seeing the chakra in his own eyes, which would render him practically blind. He shrugged his shoulders after a while of thinking. It was something to ponder in meditation, not while traversing unknown tunnels while being escorted by a group of trained shinobi. He just settled for counting and memorizing the various twists and turns he wasn't supposed to be able to feel. He had no intentions of doing anything wrong in Taki, but he had promised to protect Shizuku no matter what, so he could never be too prepared for anything, even escaping a ninja village. Again. Time to get up, Fu. A single pair of dull orange eyes snapped open as the sound of a fist banging against a metal door rang through the small room. Fu snorted at the word, even as she thought it. It wasn't a room, it was a prison cell. From the drab white walls to the metal door complete with sliding observation port, the room screamed captivity. The girl had already been awake an hour before the call had come, as she always was, as it always had been for the past 12 years of her life. Slowly she lifted herself up off the barren metal floor from where she had just finished her daily reps, managing to time it perfectly with her warden's wake-up call. Technically he was her caretaker, but Fu knew what their relationship was, just as the man did. No matter how he hid behind that fake veneer of politeness, she saw the hatred and disgust in his eyes, just like everybody else in the village. She sighed. Her life had become so monotonous she could almost count it down like clockwork. 7, 6. She slid her mesh undershirt on over her developing torso, ignoring the slight sheen of sweat she had worked up. 5, 4. Next came her white vest, cut off so that her mesh shirt poked out beneath it, which in turn ended just above her belly button. 3, 2. Finally she slipped her equally white arm warmers, one of which held her forehead protector, up onto her forearms. 1. At that exact moment the metal door creaked open to reveal a tall broad man with large muscles and a shaved head standing in the opening. Fu had known the man nearly all her life, all of it that she could remember anyway. Things were slightly hazy before the Nanabi no Kabutomushi had been sealed inside of her. Absently she glanced down at a spot just above her left breast, right over her heart. If she channeled chakra there a seal would show up, probably the most intricate one in the entire village. Come on. The man's voice was gruff, it always was, and even from where she was standing she could smell the traces of alcohol on his breath. He had no doubt been drinking the previous night. Sometimes Fu loathed the inherent abilities her tenant gave her, not that she didn't have enough things to hate about the powerful creature inside of her. An incredibly heightened sense of smell and taste were just one, and even though she had practically grown up with them, having her whole life to adjust, she still couldn't quite feel right being able to know so much about somebody from the way they smelt. For instance, her caretaker, Kanchu, had a woman in his bed last night. He still reeked of the perfume and lipstick she had worn, despite him having a shower if the scent of cheap bodywash was anything to go by. Fu could even tell what he had eaten this morning, a simple meal of some white rice, miso soup, and grilled fish. Wearily brushing her mint green hair away from her eyes she quietly followed the man out of the room. It had not taken her long to learn that speaking without being directly asked a question ended badly more often than not. At a reasonable pace the two made their way through the earthen corridors of the compound Fu had lived in for as long as she could remember. It wasn't very large, only a few rooms with essentials for living. In fact, Fu knew exactly how many steps it took to get from her bed to anywhere in the complex. She had to shield her eyes slightly as they walked outside, the sunlight making her wince after her time in the underground dwelling. 32 steps, he walked slightly quicker today. Like the timid little girl she was supposed to be, Fu silently followed her guardian as they made their way through the village, only passing through back alleys and the less populated areas of course. They wouldn't want to offend the villagers by having the demon girl make an appearance anywhere in the public eye. Fu couldn't help it as her eyes narrowed and her fists clenched, immediately stopping as she noticed Kanchu look back over his shoulder at her. Finally they stopped at a location the girl was also intimately acquainted with, her personal training ground. She snorted in her mind again. The only reason it was hers was because after using it once nobody else would dare come near it again. Everybody had this idiotic notion that they might fall under her demonic influence, or some nonsensical rubbish like that. Then again she couldn't be all that sure of their motives. It wasn't like she had talked to anybody besides her caretaker, a handful of shinobi that she was forced to work with on missions, and the village leader Shibuki. A rare sliver of hope had once entered Fu's heart when the previous leader of Taki had passed away from consuming the hero's water. She had hoped with all her heart that Shibuki would be different because he was around her age. He might feel some sympathy or just feel something for her other than disdain. She was right, the boy didn't hate her like the majority of the village. Unfortunately he was weak-willed, easily manipulated by his advisors, and ultimately, nothing changed. She walked out into the middle of the field, noticing the scratch marks in the ground that might have been ignored had she not known it was a vast sealing array. It was a part of a gift from Konoha to cement the alliance between the two nations, designed to restrain and neutralize Biju chakra with a single hand sign. Its genius lay in the fact it was powered by the very energy it was restraining, so once it had returned to tolerable levels the seal would naturally disengage, far too brilliant to have ever been thought up by the idiots in her village. That earned yet another mental scoff. Her village, it was like an inmate saying, his prison. This village was no more her home than the soil it lay on was. She only wore the headband because any possible signs of disloyalty would be severely stamped out, by repeated and painful punishment. She absently scratched at the collar around her neck, to all the world appearing as just a simple leather choker with an intricate tribal-like design running its circumference. Fu knew better. With a single hand sign it would instantly send enough electricity through her body that, even while under the influence of her inner demon, would incapacitate her. Depending on the amount of chakra that Kanchu, Shibuki, the advisors, or occasionally shinobi she was on missions with chose to use, it would either knock her out, give her a painful and humiliating shock, or even kill her. Not even her regenerative powers would save her from the huge amounts of energy that would be emitted by the collar. It was her insurance, a cage without bars or even a key. As far as Fu knew, the collar would only ever come off when she died. Maybe not even then, so they could torment her corpse too. Once her training was complete, she was once again led through the now darkening village, cast into shadow by the sun descending behind the great tree in the center of the village. For many it was a symbol of Takigaku's strength and resolve. To Fu, as she descended into a passage right at its base, it was just another reminder of her imprisonment. The door to her cell closed behind her with a metallic clunk, a tray of food sliding in just before it closed, leaving her in silence again. She sat on the bed, staring at the floor. She already knew there were 36 floor tiles, she had counted them hundreds of times. There were 14 cracks on the roof, 3 small holes in the earthen walls, 7 roots sticking out in random places and 26 scratched on her tough metal bed. This room was her home, it was her life, it was her prison. She listened to Kanshu's steps walking away before sighing quietly as she picked up her tray of food. 32 steps. She finished up her meal, just white rice that was slightly stale and a few raw slices of fish, only the best for the demon. She placed the tray back in its usual place before retiring to her bed, quickly stripping off her now sweaty and dirty clothes. She closed her eyes as she fruitlessly tried to find a comfortable position on the bed. When she opened again it would all begin anew.